Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, stocks end the week lower after a surprise breakthrough from a Chinese startup fuels fears America's AI lead is shrinking. Xi Jinping promises AI for all at a summit in Shanghai.
The use cases of AI are only limited by your imagination. So how about a ride on this funky robot vehicle?
Plus, new U.S. strikes near the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. Iran says the U.S. is targeting bridges, tunnels, and other civilian infrastructure. This morning, Tehran threatening a full-scale retaliation.
And more than 100 million Americans are under air quality alerts because of smoke from Canadian wildfires that have led President Trump to threaten Canada with new tariffs, what it means for the grid and for the World Cup.
Very happy Saturday. Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters here in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Alexis Christoforous in for Lisa Mateo today. It is Saturday, July the 18th. Hearty welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms, on radio, on television, streaming on Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app.
And welcome back, David Gura,
Thank you very much.
Because you were somewhere very fun this week. You were in Aspen, but you did do some work.
I drew the short straw, yes. I was in Aspen for the Aspen Security Forum and did a bunch of interviews. We'll bring you a lot of those conversations over the course of this morning and tomorrow as well. But good to be back in New York. I did miss a lot of the wildfire.
So you missed a lot of smoke. The air is actually better today. We're going to talk about that later on in the show. But first, we're going to go to Alexis with the news.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. And the U.S. and Iran are exchanging strikes for the seventh straight time. This time, they are targeting infrastructure and military targets as their battle over the Strait of Hormuz intensifies. Also, we are seeing Iran now hit places like Bahrain and Kuwait as it responds to the U.S. attacks. They are warning of a full-scale offensive in the coming days if its barrage continues through the weekend. Catastrophic flash floods in Texas have killed at least 2 people and left hundreds more in need of rescue. In Uvalde County, months worth of rain has fallen in just a span of days. This man says floodwaters rushed through his home twice this week.
There was maybe about 2 inches on this concrete slab, water. So it didn't look like it was getting any better. And I could mark it off. There's no more fence, but when the fence was there prior, I could mark it off and I knew it was rising.
Rain has eased across parts of Texas, but officials warn the danger is far from over and the risk of isolated tornadoes remains. Taylor Farms is voluntarily removing some of its iceberg lettuce from the U.S. market after it was linked to the parasitic illness that causes explosive diarrhea. The California farm says the iceberg lettuce was sourced from central Mexico. Taco Bell has also removed defective lettuce from its restaurants and supply chain amid the outbreak. Nearly 7,000 cases of the foodborne illness are being investigated nationwide, with Michigan reporting the highest number of cases. Poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of the Canadian wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium. And President Trump will be there as Argentina looks to defend its title against Spain. The president praised FIFA at a World Cup reception yesterday at Trump Tower in New York City.
I want to congratulate every team that made the 2026 World Cup one of the all-time greatest sporting events in history. And I think beyond a sporting event, this has been not just a sporting event. This has been far beyond a sporting event. This has been something very, very special.
Mr. Trump is expected to deliver the FIFA World Cup trophy to the winning team on the field after the match.
Thank you very much. And I think this is going to be it'll be a huge traffic mess here in New York City.
This is why I'm watching from the comfort of my air-conditioned living room.
Smart.
They were already rolling up part of Midtown preparing for this yesterday. I saw Secret Service escorting out linens from one of the hotels. Obviously, they wanted a pathway out.
The compounding factor of the traffic plus him being there, I think, will make this
not enough happening in New York in the summer.
Stay away if you can.
It's going to be great. It's going to be great. Thanks, Alexis.
Alexis, thank you very much. Tech stocks tumbled again this week over concerns about AI spending and semiconductor supply. But it was the surprise announcement from a Chinese startup drawing parallels to last year's DeepSeek moment.
That's right. Joining us more is Mike Shepard, Bloomberg's senior editor for technology and strategic industries, and Bloomberg's China correspondent, Minmin Lo. Thank you both so much for joining us. Minmin, I want to start with you. What is this announcement? What was the reaction to this Moonshot AI? And you were over there with all these tech people. What was the energy like?
The energy was really insane. It was so crowded today, and mind you, it was a very, very hot day, but it's drawn a huge amount of crowd at this World AI conference in Shanghai. I went to Moonshot AI's booth. That's the Chinese startup that was behind the new Kimi K3 model. They just launched that model. It is the largest ever in China, 2.8 trillion parameters, and the company says that it outperforms all rivals except for Anthropic's latest Fable 5, as well as OpenAI's ChatGPT 5.6. So it's really, I think, taken the world by surprise because of how fast China's AI model is closing the gap with the US, despite not being able to access some of these advanced chips from NVIDIA. And that's why we saw a huge market reaction, the sell-off that we saw across Asia. The Kospi is down more than 6% because investors are now really reassessing whether or not all that capex by Samsung and SK Hynix, $600 billion into new factories, is that really justified given that China is doing it better and cheaper?
Mike Shepard, I learned a new word this week. It's distillation. I heard it a lot at that Aspen Security Forum, and I guess it's kind of code for stealing or using models that are in existence, kind of replicating them, building on them. And there are a lot of accusations, I guess, that that's what's happening with a lot of these Chinese AI companies. Talk a bit about that and kind of give us your sense. Put this into context, if you would, sort of where this new model stands in contrast with the ones that we talk about so much here that are made in the U.S.
We've brought up an issue, David, that is increasingly a sore spot between Silicon Valley and China. And the leading AI companies here, OpenAI and Anthropic, have increasingly beaten the drum for policymakers to hear that they think that some of the results that their models are generating are being extracted en masse in an unfair and improper fashion, a way that violates their terms of usage by Chinese startups, and then being used to develop a rival generation of chatbots. They haven't pointed the finger specifically at Kimi K3, but they have recently, and we reported just a few weeks ago, that Anthropic itself was pointing the finger at Alibaba, accusing it of a large-scale campaign of distillation. Now, to be clear, this is a technique that is commonly accepted when it comes to AI, when you have a larger model used to build a smaller model, a larger frontier model whose data are extracted and results are extracted to produce something that's a little smaller, more focused, and less advanced. But the claim from Silicon Valley is that, look, what's happening is that all of the physical investments that we're making and spending all these billions of dollars on are being instead used by Chinese competitors to build this rival generation. Now, earlier today, we did hear from the Chinese deputy foreign minister rejecting those accusations. It was really the first and most prominent public statement from China's government with respect to that. But we can expect to see this come up between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping if their planned meeting in September goes ahead.
Yeah, the timing of this, Mike, is really interesting. I mean, I'm assuming this is all related. This is why we saw this huge dip in chip stocks when this announcement came out. Is that just about this model, or does that kind of compound on some of the concerns about this CapEx investment? Especially, it seems to me, when you look at what China can bring to the table, if they have the technology side. Here in the U.S., we focus so much on the energy aspect, on building these data centers, on whether or not they can support them. That seems a lot easier to do coming out of a top-down system like Beijing. Is that part of this concern as well?
It certainly is. And what you're seeing really is a return of that crisis of confidence in whether the AI trade will really sustain itself. And can all of the investments that these companies are making in what could be trillions of dollars in infrastructure for data centers and chips and other materials, will they keep going? And can they justify it? And it's harder to justify if there are cheaper and just as good models out there being offered, and also models that can be downloaded. One of the differences that you see with OpenAI and Anthropic is, their models are generally accessed through a website, through an API, at an enterprise level. With the Chinese approach, you've seen these startups use what's called open weight. That means you can just download it, modify it, adjust the parameters, and really tailor it to your needs. It's a lot harder to do that with some of the frontier models being developed by the US AI labs right now. And that is, again, something that people are also questioning, the interoperability and functionality of what the US labs are producing. And then there's the cost. And Min pointed to the fact that many of these Chinese companies are now offering their services at a much lower rate. And the companies here in the US that are trying to buy these services are starting to look at the bottom line and thinking, hey, all this AI that we're telling our employees to use, it's starting to cost us. So that is, again, another factor in this, and it is causing this big downdraft across the markets here.
We compare these models, we compare the kind of technological advancements. It's also interesting to look at the contrast between the US's approach and China's approach. And that's something I talked about with Elizabeth Economy, who's a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University a couple of days ago. We talked about just sort of the Chinese strategy compared to the US strategy. Let's take a listen.
Xi Jinping has a grand vision for how they're going to deploy AI in every sector of the economy, in the educational system, in the logistics system, certainly in the military. I don't feel as though we have that vision of taking all of our incredible, innovative work, the most advanced models in the world, but how are we going to make them practicable for our economy? How are they going to be used? And again, in that transition, how do we make it not destabilizing?
Min, let me turn to you on this first, if I could. I'm curious, sort of, if you could expand on that a little bit. You heard from President Xi yesterday at this conference. Talk a bit about kind of the way that the Chinese government is embracing advancements in AI and thinking about it at kind of a larger strategic level.
Yeah, it's definitely an important priority for the Chinese government. In fact, they are grooming this entire AI sector as the next big export engine for China as the country transitions away from older industries like property, which is really in a big slump for several years now. So they're pouring a lot of investments to provide the patient capital to groom all these startups in this sector. And it's all part of the 5-year plan that China had laid out early this year, right, in March at the 2 sessions. They have a AI Plus plan where they want to encourage adoption of AI across all sectors of the economy over the next decade or so. And just to give you a sense of how important AI is, this World AI Conference in Shanghai is in the 9th edition. And I remember in the early years, not many journalists would even bother attending, but now it's a completely different story. Even President Xi himself came to town to grace the event personally. And this really represents an upgrade to the status of this event, which in the last 2 years, it was attended by Premier Li Qiang, who is the number 2 leader in China. And President Xi gave this big speech this year. A lot of it was, of course, also a veiled message to the U.S. as well, because he talked about how, when it comes to AI governance, the world needs to take a multilateral approach. The world needs to learn from one another, and AI development shouldn't be a solo development of one country. And all over Chinese state media, you look at the Communist Party mouthpiece, People's Daily, they have been publishing editorials about how tech and AI should not become a monopoly. It should really be treated as a global public good that is shared with the rest of the world. So again, President Xi positioning himself as this leader of the global south, advocating for bridging the digital divide. So he announced a few key initiatives, including offering at least 5,000 training opportunities in AI for people in the developed countries and allowing them, some 30 countries, to tap into this AI-powered meteorological system to safeguard their homes, for example. So really, and also, yes, a couple of days ago, there were some 29 countries who signed up to be part of this China-led group called the World AI Cooperation Organization. And it's just yet another platform that could give China more sway in shaping global AI norms.
Mike, how does this impact American companies? I mean, obviously, they're already down the road with a lot of these investments. They can't claw them back at this point, but they have to be looking at this and being very concerned. Is there a way for them to pivot? And then you also have the Trump administration starting to talk about having a new regulatory agency specifically for AI. Does that compound the difficulties American AI companies could now face?
Well, I'll take the second part first there, Christina, because it's the latest, and it was a scoop from last night from our team here in DC. And the companies actually would welcome some sort of a coherent approach to AI safety reviews. And at issue is, they did not like the way that Anthropic's Fable 5 and Mythos 5 were essentially ordered off the market via export controls over concerns that the guardrails on them weren't adequate. And we saw the same sort of pressure put on OpenAI. But the companies had felt that it was overboard and also kind of ad hoc in the approach, and they would like to see a more coherent framework. And what's taking shape is, a FINRA-like model, one that would resemble what the broker-dealer industry on Wall Street faces, that it's an industry funded and not industry run, but industry certainly has a lot of input to how the rules of the road are set. And in this case, it would be the safety testing. And that would give them a little bit more of, a clear path forward when it comes to dealing with the government and how far they can take their models as they develop them. More broadly, though, the question of how companies are reading this moment. Look, many of them are playing the long game. And all this week, we heard from TSMC, they were reporting, look, we are seeing demand for AI chips and AR hardware going through 2030. It is going to be hard to meet. And that is a message that was echoed by SK Hynix during Ed Ludlow's interview with the CEO just a little more than a week ago, as they were making their public market debut here in the U.S. And that it's a message that's been reinforced by NVIDIA Chief Executive Officer Jensen Huang. They just see the demand from hyperscalers here in the U.S. and even elsewhere as being off the charts. And NVIDIA also caught a bit of a break, and some of the other American companies caught a break too, with the declassification of the United Arab Emirates, which is trying to establish itself as a real center of development for AI. And they see that as a new market that they can break into and try to export the American tech stack. But really, you do see this contrast of visions, though. Xi Jinping laying out something that is very multilateral, and President Donald Trump arguing one that is very much America first. And it really doesn't have all the pieces together in the same way that you do see China putting on the table now.
Mike Shepard, thank you very much. Senior editor there in Washington, D.C. Min-Min Lo, thank you for joining us as well from Shanghai on this Saturday. And picking up on what you're just bringing up there, this kind of modeled after FINRA, financial regulator, we'll see if that has legs, but it does seem to have the endorsement of a lot of these big AI executives, as Mike was noting just a moment ago. And
Which you kind of understand. They're going to be regulated. They want it to be consistent. They want to be able to say, like, look, we've met these qualifications, and then have an argument to push back if something like this were to happen again. Yeah.
I'm going to put up a full screen here, a picture here for our viewers, and describe it to folks on radio. We saw as a result of this chip sell-off, this agita surrounding AI this week, NVIDIA's market cap really falling and Apple catching up once again. So these two companies really vying for that market leadership, and we are at the cusp of tech earnings. We get a bunch of them this week. I should say NVIDIA, I don't think we get next earnings until August. Apple at the end of the month, but certainly be watching all of that unfold here in the weeks ahead.
Quite the rivalry. Those dots meeting there in the middle.
Many trillions of dollars at stake.
All right.
All right, coming up here, will a new Russia sanctions bill finally make it through the U.S. Congress as the war with Ukraine intensifies? My conversation with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer from the Aspen Security Forum. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Trump is blaming Canada for smoke from ongoing wildfires that have drifted into the U.S. In a Truth Social post yesterday, the president accused Canada of, quote, willful negligence in forest management. He said the economic cost of the pollution should be added to tariffs on Canadian imports. Poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of those wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium, where Argentina will defend its title against Spain. And Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen is promising an aggressive tack against voter fraud ahead of the midterm elections. The DHS chief held a briefing at the White House after President Trump's primetime address Thursday night, where he revived unsubstantiated claims about the 2020 election.
If you are an illegal or you're voting illegally, we will hunt you down. We will find you, and we will prosecute you.
Secretary Mullen also threatened state election officials with fines or even prison time if they don't hand over sensitive voter data to DHS. David and Christina.
Alexis, thank you very much.
All right, a Russia sanctions bill to honor the late Senator Lindsey Graham now has 84 co-sponsors. It was one of Graham's last efforts to find a compromise aimed at trying to help end the war in Ukraine, imposing more tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil and gas and widening those mandatory sanctions.
President Trump appears to be on board with that legislation.
They're seriously thinking, and this is in honor of Lindsey. This was his thing. He wanted this more than any other thing. You know how he felt. and there's a good chance that it gets done.
I talked about this with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer at the Aspen Security Forum earlier this week.
There are a lot of elements to this bill. There's a tariff element, there's a sanctions element, all of which are designed to give the president discretion to deploy pressure on Russia and those who are supporting Russia. So we've worked very constructively with the Senate on this. There are a lot of good things to be said about it. I just spoke with the president about it as well. So I think there's an openness there. I think we'll see within the next couple of days, final views from the president on whether he wants to be supportive. I think that we have it in a pretty good place. I think it's meaningful that this is something that Senator Graham and I and Senator Blumenthal and others were working on up until his last days, and that's meaningful as well.
It would give the president the latitude to impose tariffs of up to 100%, as I understand it, on the largest importers of Russian oil. Any indication from him if he's prepared to do that should this be passed? Well,
I think, when I talk to the president about this kind of issue, he wants to be careful about the way he deploys this kind of leverage. Geopolitics are very fragile, and this is something, whether it's a tariff action or sanctions action or anything, it's something that the president thinks about very carefully. He certainly talks to me, he talks to Secretary Besson, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Lutnick. He talks to everybody. He talks to people outside the government. He wants to hit the right spot of putting pressure on countries and putting pressure on Russia without creating more conflict or reducing the likelihood of a peace deal.
The Section 122 tariff set to expire in just a couple of days, really a few days from now.
July 24th.
July 24th. All but certain that the 301 tariff is going to affect after that, or are we looking at perhaps a lapse kind of in coverage?
The reality is the Section 301 investigations I'm doing, where we've proposed some tariffs, they're on their own track. We're moving quickly, deliberately, because we want to resolve the unfair trading practices that we're targeting with these investigations. So we're going to do them as soon as we can to get at these practices, whether they're, day before, day of, day after. That's less important to us than making sure we're addressing these unfair trading practices and getting the leverage in place we need to resolve them.
Do you have a timetable for when you're going to bring that report to the president, when you might see them enacted?
Well, we have a couple, right?
Yeah.
So we have a Section 301 on forced labor, targeting countries who don't ban the import of forced labor goods. We do in America, other countries don't. Some have a law, but they don't necessarily enforce it. So we already have our report out on that, and so we can take action, I think, fairly quickly on that within the next few weeks. We have another investigation that's targeting a more compact group of countries on structural excess capacity. These are countries who typically have a big trade deficit with the world, or a big trade surplus with the world, or a big trade surplus with us, or even if they don't, they may have practices that generate, factories or production that are totally out of whack with global demand. So this is a quite intense project. I have dozens and dozens of attorneys and policy makers working on this to really examine all of these practices. So it takes a little longer time than doing this forced labor one, which is a little bit of a binary where you're looking at what do they have in place and are they enforcing it. This is more complex.
Does that explain the delay entirely, or how long it's taking, or there's been reports that maybe the China issue is complicating it more than it is with the others?
No, I don't think that's the case at all, right? China is included in this structural excess capacity, Section 301. The reality is it's a more complex investigation, and we have to make sure that we are hitting our milestones. We've received a lot of comments from the public. We have to analyze those. We have to incorporate them into any responsive action we might take. So we're trying to make sure that we're actually living up to the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. We want to make sure that we're targeting these unfair trading practices that have led to, frankly, offshoring in the U.S. and an inability to build new factories at times. When you have other countries that are building factories or they're depressing demand in their own country, this is not how market economics are supposed to work. And it creates a situation where there's not enough incentive to build a new factory in America or to employ American workers because we have overcapacity elsewhere. So we want to make sure that capacity is restricted, or that we mitigate it somehow in our own economy so we can have market incentives to build here and to make here.
I want to ask you about rare earths, and I wonder how you would assess China's performance when it comes to rare earths. And as we get closer to October, do you anticipate that agreement will be renewed in due course?
So China's compliance with the rare earth elements of our agreements, it's not perfect. I think everyone knows that. You can read that in the paper. That being said, we are getting a flow of rare earths. We don't have factories shutting down because they don't have it. But again, we really want to be in a position where we were, in 2024 and 2023 in President Trump's first term, where we had a regular flow of rare earths. We also know that the Chinese, they use rare earths for economic coercion. They did it in 2010 and 2011. They're doing it now, so it's not necessarily surprising. But we're continuing to have some flow, and where we have gaps, where we have problems, the Secretary of the Treasury and I, we work with our counterpart in China to try to loosen that flow up. Sometimes we're more successful than others. One important thing is we're moving forward in the U.S. on rare earth production. One of the things I'm doing on my trip out west here, I'm going to Utah to visit a facility where they've discovered rare earths in the Utah desert, and they're refining them and further manufacturing them at a facility in Utah, which is a great development for U.S. national and economic security.
You've got rare earths. There's huge pharmaceutical dependence as well. And I wonder how you're thinking about that, the way that you can kind of curb our reliance on Chinese pharmaceuticals and ingredients.
Yeah, we think about this a lot. This is really critical, because at the end of the day, if somehow you lose access to Chinese inputs, it can be a huge challenge for our own manufacturing base. And some people will say, well, what about India? Fine, but a lot of the inputs that India uses also come from China. One great thing that we're seeing as we try to encourage companies to reshore is we actually have commitments from 17 pharmaceutical companies, the largest and the most major pharmaceutical companies, not only to lower prices of medication here in the U.S. Pharmaceutical prices have gone down by 2.5%. But they've also agreed to reshore here and to manufacture here. And so we have companies like Eli Lilly and Novartis and others actually pouring concrete and superstructures going up in new facilities in North Carolina and Indiana and Southern California. So this actually, for me, has been a really bright spot of our efforts to reshore critical production in America. In the trade reps glossary, transshipments is a word. Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering how you are thinking about monitoring and blocking transshipment when it comes to China.
So it is a word in our glossary, but it can mean different things, right? There's kind of like your pure illegal transshipment where something's made in China, they send it to Vietnam, and they put a made in Vietnam sticker and send it over. It's just illegal, right? And that's on Customs and Border Protection to enforce that, right? To do investigations, to identify areas of fraud and go after it. And we're doing that. A day or two ago, we had a big announcement with DOJ teaming up with CBP. They've already found $1 billion in customs fraud, and some of that is transshipment. And then you have another issue where you have, it's often Asian inputs, China, Vietnam. They go to a third country, maybe Mexico, and they do just enough work where they can legally say, this is actually from Mexico, so maybe we should get a better tariff rate than if it were from China. That's an issue, and that's a problem. With Mexico, right now, for example, in some of our discussions, we're talking about rules of origin and saying if you want to get a better deal bringing something in from Mexico, or name your country, you have to make sure it actually has U.S. content. You have to make sure it actually has Mexican content or whatever it is, and you have to have that as high as possible to protect against this other type of transshipment, which is a little more difficult to detect.
There's a long way to go until this meeting in September when the Chinese president comes to the United States, but let me ask you lastly sort of how you're thinking about that. You were so integral to the conversations that took place in Beijing. What are you expecting, deliverables-wise, to come out of that meeting in Washington in a couple months?
Well, the number one deliverable we always have between President Trump and President Xi is to continue the stability of the relationship. Both of these leaders are very committed to having a strong and solid personal relationship. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have issues in the broader relationship. Obviously, we do. China is a big challenge for the U.S. in a lot of ways. But we want to make sure we're delivering stability. There's never been a situation where the U.S. side or even the Chinese side has gone out and said, everyone should expect a comprehensive agreement that resolves all issues. Like, no one's ever promised that, so that's not what we expect. We will have an opportunity to take stock of Chinese commitments with respect to purchases of soybeans and other agricultural products. We'll take stock on the rare earth issues we decided. So I think it'll be a moment for stock taking, confirming the relationship, making sure that China's complying with what it's agreed to do. That's really what we're looking forward to in this meeting.
I just want to linger on the moment that we're in right now, and you heard him talking a bit about it. We have these 122 tariffs. These are the global tariffs that the president put in place after the Supreme Court ruled against those IEEPA tariffs. Those, by statute, expire here on July 24th, as he said. Then there are these investigations. There are ones that center on industrial overcapacity, ones that center on forced labor. So
but those have to do for each country, right?
Yes, so we have like 80 plus countries that the administration is looking at. So that's kind of where we are poised for now. Which of those will go into effect? And so as we were speaking, we were waiting to hear about Brazil, which is one ultimately did go in effect that afternoon. 25% tariffs on Brazil, which has, of course, caused a great deal of controversy and stress there. And it's a real political issue as well. And the last thing I'll just note about Ambassador Greer is just, it's a lot to keep track of. I was struck by that just talking to him about this, the way that this administration is pursuing trade policy on this country by country basis, not using these multilateral agreements, means he's traveling everywhere. He's going to Mexico next week, just hyper engaged on so many different fronts. It was interesting to talk about that.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is it any clearer who or what mechanism is carrying out these investigations? Like, he's obviously not doing every one personally, but he seems very involved.
That's doing it. And before he and I spoke, he was on a panel at this conference or had a one-on-one interview with an interlocutor at the conference. And he said something that really stuck with me, which is he does all of this work, but ultimately it's like the president's relationship is still paramount here. And so in the context of Canada, for instance, if there are good conversations between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump, that could lead to a deal. I'm not saying that that's happening, but that still is fundamentally that he can do all of this work, but really it is the principles that matter the most here in these conversations.
But that's something we were talking about last week, too, is you have these negotiators, but how empowered are they when ultimately it's the president who has last word and everybody in the room knows that? So you can get all the way down that road and it could be undone or redone with a tweet, right?
Absolutely. And what I will say is, and he said this during the interview as well, is he is talking to the president a ton. I think the president does have a lot of faith and trust in him, and they're in constant contact. And no surprise to you or anyone here, this is an issue, the issue perhaps that animates the president the most. So very engaged with him and clearly trusting of Ambassador Greer.
Seems like it was a good conference. I'm
Great
not at all
conference.
upset that I didn't get to go hang out in my home state. It's fine. It's fine. I'm over it. Yeah, that's right. All right. Speaking of mountains and wildfires, we're just talking about this. Smoke from Canadian wildfires is threatening to send thick black smoke back to the northeast. We're going to talk about what the economic impact of extreme weather is. That's coming up on Bloomberg this weekend. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend, I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. Apple and the U.S. Justice Department are in early talks about settling a 2024 lawsuit that alleges the iPhone maker violated antitrust laws. Bloomberg reports there's no guarantee the two sides will reach an agreement. The U.S. government accused Apple of monopolizing the market for high-end smartphones by blocking super apps and discouraging outside messaging solutions. On Wall Street, it was another rough week for chip makers as traders continue to rotate out of those stocks on worries that the artificial intelligence spending spree is becoming harder to justify. A key industry gauge, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, fell into a bear market, sinking 20% from its June record. For the week, the tech-heavy NASDAQ fell nearly 2.7%. And SpaceX shares tumbled again yesterday, wiping out more than $1 trillion in market value after the company aborted a launch of its Starship rocket because of an engine issue. Despite the recent sell-off, Wall Street remains largely bullish on SpaceX. More than 80% of Bloomberg-tracked analysts rate the stock a buy equivalent, and the average price target suggests about 90% upside from current levels. Round 3 of the British Open is underway at the Royal Birkdale Golf Club in Southport, England. At the top of the leaderboard, Lucas Herbert at 8 under par. And the match will go on. Soccer's governing body says the World Cup final tomorrow between Argentina and Spain is not under any threat of the air quality warnings in New York and New Jersey because of the Canada wildfires. Meteorologists expect the weather to improve by tomorrow's game at MetLife Stadium. Guys, back over to you. Looking forward to that one.
Yes,
Thanks,
likewise. You're going to watch this one?
I promise I will
You'll watch this
one. I promise.
At the very least, you'll watch the final
promise.
game.
Lisa's not here to give me a hard time,
No.
but I
I'm
feel
happy to
her
fill
by
that out,
proxy
though.
giving me a hard time.
No.
So yes, we will watch it. Thanks, Alexis. I do feel like the air has gotten slightly better.
Yes,
However,
agree.
the president may not agree because in response to the Canadian wildfires, President Donald Trump took to Truth Social, saying this is willful negligence and becoming a yearly occurrence costing the United States billions of dollars, which cost of this pollution must of necessity be added to the tariffs Canada is currently paying.
For more on the extreme weather around North America, including these fires, joining us in studio is Bloomberg energy reporter Emily Forgash. Emily, great to have you with us. And let's start local. As you say, Christina,
all news is local.
All news is local. But it does feel better today. Talk just a bit about what we've experienced here over the course of the last week. How much Canada does these fires do bear responsibility for it? And then indeed, looking at this World Cup, what it means for that match tomorrow.
Yes, so the air in New York was quite bad this week. If you remember 3 years ago when there were Canadian wildfires that sent smoke down to New York area, it wasn't nearly as bad as that, but other places around the country were also experiencing terrible air this week. It has gotten a bit better today and will keep getting better through the day. We expect some rain in New York today that should help. And yeah, the World Cup match seems to be happening tomorrow, although that can always change.
Was there any fail-safe? Like, has this happened before? Is air quality canceled games, World Cup? So I don't know the answer to that.
Well, there were games canceled yesterday in Cleveland. Cleveland and like the Chicago area was hit really hard, so there was a baseball game canceled last night. There are often wildfires in Canada around this time. It gets dry, it gets windy. The smoke only comes down if the wind pushes it down, and there was a jet stream that happened this past week that caused the smoke to come down, but also that jet stream was responsible for a lot of the other issues we saw this week.
Let's talk a bit about heat, which is part of this whole conversation as well. I know you cover utilities, and I see the emails that I get from Con Ed indicating when I should have the AC on or off and how my behavior should change as a result.
Our building would like us to keep it at 76 degrees.
76, 78.
Oh, it's warm. It is warm.
Yes, it is.
How are utilities reacting to all of the kind of extreme weather that we've seen here in the summer so far?
Yeah, it's getting increasingly challenging for utilities and for grid operators to meet demand that comes with turning on your AC and other things when it gets really hot. Another issue that utilities are contending with is in California. It was also dry and windy, and that's the perfect atmosphere and temperature for fires. And oftentimes fires can start because of electricity sparking it. So PG&E, which is a utility in California, had to turn off power for some people on Wednesday, forced shutoffs in order to avoid any wildfires. There were wildfires in Canada, unfortunately. And then grid operators throughout the U.S. in the middle of the country and the East Coast were issuing some warnings when it got really hot on Wednesday and Thursday.
Are we expecting more pause in service, more grid stops like on the East Coast? How is the grid doing? Because we talked at the start of the show today about AI and, energy costs are getting more expensive, and it just seems like we're putting a lot of pressure on some pretty old grids.
Yes.
Should we expect some more interruptions?
That is a great way to put it. We are putting a lot of pressure on some old grids. For this week, the PJM grid, which is in the mid-Atlantic, which actually includes Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, only issued an energy emergency Alert 1, which just means that the grid was becoming stressed. The middle of the country grid, that one issued an EEA 2, which is one step below rolling blackouts, but those grids did not have to institute rolling blackouts this time. If you remember 2 weeks ago, right before July 4th, it was even hotter here, and the grids were even more stressed. So this is becoming just more frequent as the summer gets hotter and it gets longer. It starts earlier and goes longer.
Wandering around the neighborhood, people have masks back on. There is, like as you talked about, we had this experience a couple of summers back where it had this post-apocalyptic look to the city, hard to see the sun. Everything looked really kind of red and sepia-toned. What do we know about the dangers of this, just being in this environment, breathing all of this in? How worried people should be just about prolonged exposure to what we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how sensitive you are. So if you have asthma, if you're part of the sensitive groups, officials were telling people to stay inside. If they didn't have air conditioning while it was hot, try to go somewhere indoors where there was air conditioning. If you aren't part of sensitive groups, it can still hurt you because the levels in New York and especially in Chicago, Detroit area were really high, and that is unhealthy for anyone. There could be lasting effects, but this time, as I mentioned, was not as bad as 3 years ago. Yeah.
I mean, do they recommend a mask? It was interesting that so for those of us who traveled a lot around the world, I walked out of my apartment and it reminded me of going to developing nations where they burn trash in urban centers. Like you get that same acrid smell and it just kind of hits you in the face. It's a very distinct smell. And it was interesting to smell that in Manhattan, but places like that, I mean, people in some cities around the world have pollution days where they can't go out. They have masks with them regularly. Do you think this is going to become something that people are going to have to start doing even in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, if this keeps happening, people likely will keep wearing masks. New York officials this week handed out free masks around the city and around New York.
Are they effective, though? Do we know?
I do think that people believe they're effective. I'm not the scientist on that, though. And I'm sure there is some efficacious masks out there. I'm not sure, just like the regular blue masks that we all
Right,
use.
if I'm
there are
putting
different
like the
levels
little
of
cute
masks.
one I sewed during COVID, is that really going to make any difference? Of course, I made it. I'm very proud of it.
Wow, that's cool.
Before we let you go, I want to ask you about Texas as well. We've seen the reports of flooding in Texas once again, and I'm curious sort of what information you have on those and sort of how likely you talk about kind of recurrence of these fires and that being, is this something we expect to see more of in Texas as well?
Yes, so the floods in Texas, unfortunately this time were deadly. 2 people died. unlike last year when over 130 people died, last year Texas just wasn't as prepared. The rain came overnight and so did the flash flooding. The alerts weren't as good. People were asleep, didn't hear them. This time around, Texas was way more prepared. The emergency alerts were better. Information came out earlier. Actually, Governor Abbott yesterday credited the media with getting the information out there.
Hey, look at that.
But yeah, people do expect this to keep happening. Like these 100-year floods, they're now 1 year apart in this case. And all of these things that are happening together, it's really important to understand that this could keep happening all at the same time. They're called compounding events. And as climate change gets worse, these overlapping events could keep happening. So yesterday I reported that nearly 180 million Americans were experiencing either the floods or the heat or the smoke or both. And that was almost more than half the country, and that just could keep happening.
Before we let you go, what is the economic impact of all this? Because obviously you see like the big meta impacts, but even in the city, people aren't going out, people aren't going to dinner. Like it seems like it's going to hit across all the economy.
Yeah, so the smoke could impact the economy for sure for the reasons you just mentioned, and if people are working outside and they can't. Floods, obviously, destructive floods have huge economic impacts in the billions of dollars, and if they keep happening, obviously it gets more expensive. And the exact economic toll of these floods won't be calculated for a while. I still think that parts of Texas were recovering from the floods last year. But yeah, they again, those economic effects will compound as the events do.
And also just trying to get insurance for anything in a floodplain or in a wildfire zone. We've seen people they're not getting their houses insured anymore.
Yeah.
So.
Emily, thank you very much. Emily Forgat's joining us here on set in New York. And I'll continue to talk about my trip to Colorado. I mean, it drove
Yes, please.
from
Talk
Denver
more about going to the mountains
Aspen,
without your co-anchor. It's
and
fine.
in Leadville, I mean, you see them fighting those fires. So that's another strain as well. It's just having this many major events like that and having to fight all these fires simultaneously.
And it is
difficult.
part of the natural life cycle. I mean, I grew up in the mountains, and there were fires almost every summer, but the size and scope of them is getting to extremes where it's just really
and these
impacting.
compounding events,
100%.
as I add that to my glossary. Very good. All right, when we come back here, BTW with Alexis Christoforous and the debate over accents in the Odyssey. You've been looking forward to this film.
Okay. And you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more, all in one place, Bloomberg.com/videos. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend, or BT Dubs. I'm Christina Ruffini with David Gura. Alexis is going to run us through some of the stories you might have mixed this week. Now, Alexis, there is an ongoing debate on this show. I say BT Dubs.
I say BTW. What do you think?
I have to go BTW.
Oh, 2-1. You're welcome back anytime, Alexis.
Okay, fine.
We agree to disagree.
Yes,
What you got?
It's okay. There's a little movie out this weekend, in case you heard. It's called Odyssey.
The Odyssey.
Yes,
epic.
I accidentally stumbled on the premiere as I was going to a workout the other day. They
Whoa.
closed down all of Broadway, all of Lincoln Square. The whole thing was shut down for
That's
blocks.
living in New York City,
Yes,
girl.
there you go.
$250 million budget. It's an epic to watch it, almost 3 hours long. So get your popcorn and get ready. The only movie ever shot completely on IMAX. And there's a lot of talk about it. It's doing pretty well here on Rotten Tomatoes already. It was out yesterday, and the critics seem to like it. But people cannot stop talking about the fact that these actors, Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Charlize Theron, you name it, are all having American accents in it. No British accents.
Interesting.
Which we're used to for these big epic
Classical
period
epics,
pieces.
yes.
Yeah.
But that's not any more accurate.
No, that's true.
I do think it's weird. Like British TV, a lot of times they'll have them playing Russians, but they just have like a British accent. Or they'll be in France, but they just have a British accent.
Right.
And somebody pointed out to me it's not any more accurate if they do a Russian accent. They're not speaking Russian. But for my brain, I want to hear the accent.
If you want to be accurate, you'd speak ancient Greek.
There
in
you
this.
go.
So you know what? English is fine, but it's pretty funny. Tom Holland and Robert Pattinson, who are both in it, who are both British, have to put on American accents.
Oh, interesting.
No.
And then calling, Odysseus my dad, like American colloquialism. It's
no
kind of
father.
fun.
Have you seen this yet?
I haven't. I will go see it.
I'm sure you will.
It is on my
You've been
list.
very excited about it.
I know, I'm a nerd.
You wanted to
I'm
get a
excited.
classicist on here and do a deep dive.
We're still working on it.
We're still working on it.
See,
Sorry, I don't mean
you
to
were
deal with
away.
that.
You were on it.
I have to go to hear Matt Damon use his Boston accent. He leans in on it in those dramatic scenes. So we're going to be, but Chris Nolan, who's the director, said it was a very intentional decision to have the actors speak in English and not have sort of a stagey approach.
And he's like the biggest proponent of these IMAX movies. I mean, he
Loves it.
loves an IMAX film, and I do his movies generally.
And they figured out a way, as we've talked about, to do the dialogue on IMAX, which you usually don't do. Usually you shoot the big scenes on it, and it can only roll for, I think, 7 minutes at a time.
Yeah.
That's
so
why
it's
this is
really
a feat.
arduous, and I appreciate trying to do old school filmmaking in a world of digital.
Cinematic feat.
I don't know. I'll report back on the accents.
All right. What
We're
else
going to
you
do
got?
a
What
hard
else?
turn and move to the Wall Street Journal. Wealthy older Americans, they are ripping up the traditional script, and instead of downsizing, they are moving up big time.
Interesting.
They are buying bigger homes, or they are adding additions to the homes. They are adding guest houses
Making
for
a
the
compound.
grandkids. Exactly, basically. And so empty nest boomers now own more than 28% of U.S. homes with 3 or more bedrooms, which, ding, 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 one of the reasons why first-time home buyers are having such a hard time getting into the market.
First Airbnb and now this.
Yeah, exactly.
The older
that's a good
generation.
point.
That is a good point.
Buying it out.
I will rent until I die.
You will?
I've missed my boat. Yeah, there's no, well, especially in New York, but even in DC, to your point, getting into the market was just getting harder and harder
That's
and harder.
that's so many people struggle. So just a quick stats for you.
Yeah.
Older Americans now account for 42% of the home buyers, the largest share of any generation. Why, you ask? Well, they bought their homes and their stocks decades ago, and those assets have appreciated
Refinanced at 2.5% or whatever.
Yeah, sounds pretty nice. If you can get it.
Pretty nice indeed.
Dare to dream,
All right.
dare to dream.
Birding. Do you ever look at the birds go by?
Okay, speaking of older Americans, what happens to people when they hit a certain age? Both my parents have gotten into this.
Young people
Well,
too.
guess what? Birding is not just for your parents. It's not
Oh.
for your grandparents anymore. Oh, no. Birding
look at
has
this.
gone
Okay.
cool. So now the cool kids are doing it, becoming more popular among younger people in their 20s and 30s. Some of them are saying, hey, look, we're taking our binoculars with us on vacation because we want to go birding. They say the shift really started during the pandemic when we were all stuck at home.
Nice
And
solitary activity.
We were like, hey, wow, look at the birds.
Yeah.
You sort of the equivalent of, take a moment and smell the flowers. That's what we're doing with our birds. And also the National Audubon Society had 10 college chapters in 2019. You know how many they have today?
No.
117.
Wow.
That's hysterical.
It's crazy. And
David, were you a birder in college?
I have a family of birders.
Oh, you do?
My sister's a professional ornithologist.
Oh my, what?
And when my mom came to town, she did bring binoculars. We went to the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Reserve and looked for a bunch of birds.
You're
That
living
is
this.
so
in
I'm
your
living
home.
it. I'm living it. But my sister studies the great gray owl. That's
All
her
right, well,
bird.
can we have
She's a
her on the
PhD.
show? I already like her better than you.
Sure. Next time she's in town,
Super
we'll bring her in.
impressed. Super impressed with that.
This is lovely and wholesome. I support this trend full-heartedly.
Let's do South by Southwest even has a whole bird watching thing. So it's it's happening amongst the young folks.
The young.
All right, finally,
Last one.
a habit that's actually good for us. A new study found that people who drink coffee on a daily basis, both caffeinated and decaffeinated, have a lower likelihood of developing liver ailments compared with non-coffee drinkers.
I'm gonna live forever.
So,
Really?
but this stat kind of scared me. Scientists at Cedars-Sinai Health University found drinking 5 or more cups of coffee a day
David Gura.
was
David
associated
Gura.
with a 47% lower risk of developing liver cancer.
Oh.
5
Oh,
cups.
so
5 cups.
he drinks a lot of coffee.
I drink a lot of coffee, mostly just out of habit. Like we walk by the machine and I'll pick some up, but I'm a real...
Well, because it's so at the ready here for us. Why is this, though, you might ask?
Yeah.
Inquiring minds want to know. Due to chemical compounds in coffee that reduce inflammation. Chlorogenic acid.
Chlorogenic acid.
So I say, here's to chlorogenic
Here's to that.
acid.
I'm having a tea today, but still, there's caffeine.
There's
in it.
caffeine.
Cheers.
It's my tea. Here we go.
Okay,
Here we go.
Cheers.
Oh, I'm the only one with the fancy
Well,
mug right
that's
now.
well, you know.
Well, we put our water
It's
in our
all
mug.
branded,
All right,
you know.
If people are wondering about the proliferation of cups for our TV viewers,
I
we
like
have
to have
multiple
multiple
options.
liquids
We've got water,
simultaneously.
we've got tea.
You have
we've
to
got
stay
coffee.
hydrated.
I do feel like there's always a study that says something's good about coffee or bad about coffee, and
Right. Or just like with wine.
yes,
Wine,
wine's
I
always
only believe the studies that say wine and coffee are good, to be clear, and chocolate too. Wine, coffee,
That's the
chocolate.
kind
You
of
know
peer
what?
review you're
Everything in
doing of the
moderation.
studies.
Exactly.
Yes.
I like to not fact check that at all.
No need to. Alexis Christoforous, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Debut here doing
Excellent
BTW.
work.
First time doing BTW.
And you got
W.
new info out of David. We didn't know this.
Yeah,
this
you know,
is well done.
Pulling
well
it
done.
out,
Say hi to your
developing a
sister.
profile. I will.
Okay.
Get her on the show. Maybe she'll
Yeah,
come
let's
and
go
do it.
talk about birds.
All right,
Seriously.
great. All right, thank you very much. Coming up here on 8 o'clock in New York City.
The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. It's 8 o'clock in New York City from Bloomberg's World Headquarters. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Alexis Christoforous in today for Lisa Mateo. We're bringing you the latest breaking news, reports, analysis, everything live this morning and every weekend from 7 to 10 a.m. A lot of headlines to get to. We talked in the last hour about this new Chinese AI model. We had our colleagues over there kind of talking about how that impacted the market. But of course, we do also need to talk about Iran. A lot of strikes overnight, a lot of strikes throughout this week, and kind of uncertainty about where this goes or where this ends.
The president basically ripping up that memo of understanding, ceasefire all but over, and strikes continuing overnight on Kuwait. A lot of damage done by Iran to Kuwait in the overnight hours as well. So I think the conflict seems to be widening and certainly is attenuating. It's lasting much longer than the president said it would at the beginning.
Exactly right. Alexis has some updates for us, so we're going to go to her now for the headlines.
All right, thanks a lot, Christina and David. We're going to start here at home. Catastrophic flash floods in Texas have killed at least 2 people and left hundreds more in need of rescue. In Uvalde County, months worth of rain has fallen in a span of just days. This man says floodwaters rushed through his home twice this week.
There was maybe about 2 inches on this concrete slab, water. So it didn't look like it was getting any better. And I could mark it off. There's no more fence, but when the fence was there prior, I could mark it off and I knew it was rising.
Rain has eased across parts of Texas, but officials warn the danger is far from over and the risk of isolated tornadoes remains. Taylor Farms is voluntarily removing some of its iceberg lettuce from the U.S. market after it was linked to the parasitic illness that's causing explosive diarrhea. The California farm says the iceberg lettuce was sourced from central Mexico. Taco Bell has also removed affected lettuce from its restaurants and supply chain amid the outbreak. Nearly 7,000 cases of the foodborne illness are being investigated nationwide, with Michigan reporting the highest number of cases. Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen is promising an aggressive tack against voter fraud ahead of the midterm elections. The DHS chief held a briefing at the White House after President Trump's primetime address Thursday night, where he revived unsubstantiated claims about the 2020 election.
If you are an illegal or you're voting illegally, we will hunt you down, we will find you, and we will prosecute you.
Secretary Mullen also threatened state election officials with fines or even prison time if they don't hand over sensitive voter data to DHS. Poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of those Canadian wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium. And President Trump will be there as Argentina looks to defend its title against Spain. The president praised FIFA at a World Cup reception yesterday at Trump Tower in New York City. Mr. Trump is expected to deliver the FIFA World Cup trophy to the winning team on the field after that match tomorrow. And I'm going to be there, not in person, watching from my television.
Very good. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah,
it's going to be so crazy.
Cheapest ticket, by the way, about $8,000.
My gosh.
That's insane.
Yeah, I think it's on track to be the most expensive sporting event ever.
I think it's really sad that real fans can't get into the stadium. However, I have loved the pop-up parties, the makeshift ways that people are celebrating at bodegas, at bars, at like family neighborhoods, projecting it up on the side of the wall like we saw with the Knicks.
The New York Knicks.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I think it's,
I
wish the tickets were more affordable, but people are going to celebrate regardless.
For sure.
Thanks, Alexis. All right. Now to our top story this hour. Overnight, the U.S. military says it conducted another round of attacks on Iran, striking multiple targets for the 7th straight evening. Iran says some of the attacks hit civilian targets, including a desalination plant. Iran also claims ships trying to traverse the Gulf struck mines in the water and exploded. Now, CENTCOM says that report is false.
Joining us now to help decipher what is happening and where this is going for the U.S., for Iran, and for the region as a whole, we have Bloomberg White House correspondent Josh Wingrove and Bloomberg National Security reporter Courtney McBride. Courtney, great to see you. Great to have you with us. And let me start with you. Get us up to speed here on this back and forth. It was only, 24 hours ago that the president said the U.S. is winning big in Iran, and we'll see the fruits of that labor very shortly. It does seem like we are far from this getting tied up anytime soon.
Well, thanks for having me. Certainly the president continues to profess U.S. victory in this conflict. But at the same time, we are seeing tit-for-tat strikes between the U.S. and Iran. And we're not quite at the point of an escalation to or return to full-scale conflict, but we certainly are seeing more damage and expansion of targets by the U.S., both geographically and in terms of the types of sites that are being hit.
Courtney, what is the threshold for saying we've returned to a full-scale conflict?
Well, I don't know that there's necessarily a quantifiable level, but certainly with the number of targets that the U.S. has been hitting, where CENTCOM is reporting strikes in the dozens. Early in March, in April, at the peak of the fighting, we were seeing hundreds of targets hit per day. Many of those targets are no longer viable because the U.S. has destroyed them. And so I think now that there is a sort of a vanishing number of sites they can hit, you're seeing the U.S. striking further into the country and going after bridges and infrastructure that, according to CENTCOM, is still used to support military operations, Iranian strikes on ships in the Strait, et cetera.
Josh Wingrove, let me get your perspective on how the White House is looking at this conflict now. It does seem like there's still an element here where the White House feels like it can kind of win this war of attrition just by staring Iran down. Do we have any more nuance or detail about the strategic direction of this conflict from the White House?
It's a great question. I think President Trump has pretty clearly been told by his advisors that this blockade puts more pressure on Iran than these activities and the overall situation puts on the American economy and the American armed forces. In other words, he thinks time is on his side. In his public remarks, he seems to have kind of moved on from it. Like, he doesn't talk about it as much anymore. And so I think right now we're just sort of in the status quo indefinitely. And of course, the question is what that means for him. There were a lot of Republicans who wanted a quicker end to this, or for the president to at least be serious about pursuing any deal that was actually there. The American negotiators would quibble with how serious the Iranians were about making a deal at points in time. And so we seem to just basically be here indefinitely. And what that means for the president is sort of an ongoing focus on whether they can continue to escort ships through the southern part of the Strait. Remember, of course, that was the big pressure point, Trump saying when they announced their previous deal, look, some countries only had 4 weeks left of reserves, or that kind of thing. And so if Trump can be confident that oil markets and energy markets more broadly can withstand the status quo, then I think the status quo is going to remain the status quo for some time. And, we'll see where that goes. We have not seen a lot of pushback from Republicans in recent days, or frankly, from within the administration itself and some of the more isolationist voices, including the vice president.
Yeah, Josh, I'm wondering about, I don't know if there is one, but if there's a strategy to the messaging here, because it seemed prior to that NATO meeting in Ankara, the president had kind of washed his hands. He'd even said he was a bit over it. And then there were those threats to his security. He ended up having to take the old Air Force One plane, which caused a bit of a kerfuffle. A lot of pushback from the White House on that report from the New York Times. But if you're inside the White House, I mean, we have been talking for months about how exactly what you just said. Advisors to the president, Republicans running in the midterms want this off the books when they go to run for office in November. If this is going to stretch out and have this indeterminate timeline, is the strategy just don't talk about it and maybe people will forget it's happening in the background? Is that kind of what's happening here?
I mean, I suppose you and I can come to that conclusion. I don't think that there necessarily is, a grand multi-week plan. I think they're just sort of rolling with how it goes and trying to create an ecosystem that would be, get Iran back to the table and get to a situation where that makes sense. And so, we'll see. We don't expect to hear from the president today. I should say that I'm sorry. I'm in purgatory here. I'm in New Jersey. I'm, not quite with Trump. I'm not quite at the World Cup. I'm not quite with you all. I'm just sitting here waiting in case Trump needs his press corps.
Classic New Jersey story.
Anything.
Yeah.
I know. It's a pleasure to be here. Courtney has the right Bloomberg backdrop. I have a Marriott landscape.
I was going to say, I know what hotel you're in. I've seen that picture in many a hotel room.
Exactly. So anyway, we don't think Trump in his public remarks has not been placing emphasis on this. This is a fact, and so I think from that, historically with him, we can tell that he's sort of moved on in his mind to other things. Remember, there are brewing questions about America's capacity to continue doing this, or at least the effect that it would have on American munitions reserves. Courtney is an expert on this, so let me stop there and defer to her. But there's sort of the ripple effect of doing this indefinitely and carrying out strikes on Iran indefinitely is not nothing. And so we will see how long the president's appetite is for that. But so far, it's full steam ahead.
Yeah, Chief of Naval Operations telling us last week he is concerned about how long those ships have been out, including ships like their big battle cruisers who've been out a record number of days at this point.
So let's move on from Josh Bonvoy Wingrove to Courtney McBride here. And Courtney, let's pick up on what we were just talking about there, the degree to which this war can continue in perpetuity. So Josh, rightly referencing the fact that there is such strain here on the military as this lasts longer and longer. How manifest is that concern in the halls of the Pentagon, among the president's national security advisors, that this really, there are limits to how long that this can go on?
Sure. I mean, certainly there's the public messaging that the U.S. has everything it needs to continue this war as long as the president decides to do so. That being said, there is certainly behind the scenes concern about munition stockpiles, particularly for certain high-end weapons. The Pentagon does have a plan to ramp up production, but we're talking years before some of that bears fruit. That being said, I think the strikes that are happening now may be using different types of munitions than those that were relied upon early on, that are multi-million-dollar missiles and are in much shorter supply. So at this level, short of that high-end full-scale operation that we saw in early March, in April, this could continue, at this level for quite some time.
Well, I want to pivot a little bit, quite a bit actually, Josh, and I do want to ask you about this speech the president made on Thursday. There was a lot in there, but among other things, he accused China of interfering with the U.S. elections in 2020, saying the Chinese government stole over more than 200 million voter files. But it was unclear in all those documents that were released what they really did with them or what the argument was, how they used them. Why make this speech now? What are the objectives here, especially ahead of this upcoming Xi visit to the U.S.?
Yeah, let me start by saying that I and other reporters have been going through these documents since they were released. The president has been upset there isn't more coverage of it. What I have seen in there is not a lot of new material. Many of these claims were debunked not only by American intelligence agencies, but under the Trump administration in the first term. A lot of the dates that you see on these documents are 2016, 2020, even earlier than 2016 in some cases. They're heavily redacted. They're sort of cherry-picked. It's not really clear what they're saying. And some of them also reveal Russian attempts to influence the election in the favor of President Trump, whereas the Chinese sort of breadcrumbs here are that they preferred that President Trump did not get reelected. And so I think broadly, there's bipartisan concern about the security of American elections, including foreign interference, not only with China, but with other countries. Specifically, I think the question is whether the president is using this as a narrative or a pretext to push, again, for changes to the voting systems in this year's midterm election. Of course, he's been pressing for passage of the Save America Act, which would make a lot of changes. There's been zero or next to zero appetite in Congress to do that. He's trying to strong arm it through. I think there are a lot of open questions about what steps he might take in the run-up to and during the voting period in sort of a lot of crucial districts as he tries to cling to the House. Of course, we all know that they've redrawn the map to try to maximize their chances of bucking the historical trend here where presidents tend to lose the House in their midterm elections. And so I think the question of Chinese influence is not new. The concerns about it remain valid. There was not a lot of new information from the president that I heard personally on Thursday. I think, there are concerns broadly about foreign interference, but the question, I think, is the domestic context and how the president is viewing these midterms and what levers he might try to pull in the run-up to them.
As we wrap up here, Courtney, let me turn to you on the issue of Ukraine. President Zelensky in the midst of this 40-day campaign, and we've seen another cabinet reshuffle. There's a new prime minister as well. But I'm struck by the protests that have emerged after he removed the 35-year-old defense minister from his position there. He who was really a pioneer of, an advocate for more drone warfare in this conflict.
Very effective.
Very effective. And we see, long-range drones now targeting Russia, as we've talked about on the show, Moscow, St. Petersburg, seeing them trained at the Sea of Azov as well. What do you make of this? What should we make of this? What does it say about the broader kind of strategic direction of this conflict, the latest cabinet reshuffle, Courtney?
Well, I mean, this is an approach that President Zelensky has taken before in terms of reshuffling the cabinet. But the decision to oust Defense Minister Fedorov certainly has struck a nerve, and I think has raised some very serious concerns about the battlefield impact. It remains to be seen what is going to happen in terms of permanent leadership. One of Fedorov's allies has declined to take a position at the ministry, and so I think there's a real concern that you could see a backslide in terms of Ukraine's innovative and really effective approach to striking Russia.
Do you know what prompted this decision? Why he did this now?
That is a mystery, I think, for a lot of people. Fedorov had been clashing publicly with some of the sort of military old guard. And I think there's a lot of speculation, but nothing definitive.
Josh, last question to you. I'm not going to make you respond as a Canadian to the president's allegations about these fires, but you did have a scoop this week that's Canada-related, having to do with this bridge that's kind of surrounded in controversy between the U.S. and Canada. Get us up to speed on what you've learned here through your reporting.
Yeah, very, very quickly. This is, I don't know how quickly to do this. Is like a decades-long saga. This Gordie Howe Bridge is sitting there waiting to open, and Trump, Lutnick specifically intervened to block it from opening because they wanted a bigger share. Deal was struck in 2012. The Canadians agreed to pay for everything in exchange for getting their money back. And so Prime Minister Carney has been under a lot of pressure domestically because questions are swirling whether Canada will get its money back and about what price he sort of paid to Trump to get this bridge open, for a bridge, again, built with Canadian money in the first place. And so we have viewed the document, the sort of confidential agreement. It is simple. It is one page long. And what Carney has agreed to do is kick the equivalent of net profits after operational costs for 15 years of this bridge. He said that might not be a lot of money. In fact, it might be negative at the start. And so this contradicts some of the Prime Minister's previous remarks on it, and that's why it's sort of become an issue back home. But this bridge, it just continues to be this saga. And so what they've done now is essentially set up an incentive where the more money and more traffic that goes through this toll bridge, the more money will go to this U.S.-controlled regional development fund. The current bridge is privately owned. It's kind of a wacky story. It's an incredibly busy trade bridge. Trucks, taking every car part you can think of over and over all the way. So they want a second bridge.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Building bridges, U.S. from Canada, or at least opening them. Josh Wingrove, he is our White House correspondent, and Courtney McBride, thank you so much. You're our diplomacy and national security correspondent. All right, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has plunged again with the latest round of fighting between the U.S. and Iran. What will this mean for oil prices? And is this the new normal? That's coming up next.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. Iran has unleashed one of its heaviest retaliatory strikes on Kuwait since the U.S. war began. The barrage triggered multiple rounds of sirens this morning and forced Kuwait's main airport to suspend flights. U.S. Central Command completed a 7th straight night of strikes on Iran last night, targeting surveillance sites, underground weapons, and maritime capabilities. Fresh airstrikes this morning between Russia and Ukraine. Russian authorities say 7 people were killed in a Ukrainian drone attack on warehouses run by the e-commerce site Wildfires. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says the sites were used to supply sanctioned drone and navigation parts. Meta Platforms is in early talks to lease computing power from its data centers to Anthropic. Sources tell Bloomberg News that the discussions are early and plans could change. The New York Times reported the deal could be worth up to $10 billion over 2 years. President Trump is blaming Canada for smoke from ongoing wildfires that have drifted into the U.S. In a Truth Social post yesterday, the president accused Canada of, quote, willful negligence in forest management. And he said the economic costs of the pollution should be added to tariffs on Canadian imports. Meantime, poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of those wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium when Argentina will defend its title against Spain. And if they're able to do that, guys, it'll be the first back-to-back win in the World Cup since 1962.
Very long time. Oh, wow. I was struck listening to FIFA leadership talk about how they have no backup plan for this. So I do hope the air clears well enough.
That seems, with all the money they poured into it, you think there'd be a plan B.
We're going to talk more about that later in the show. Thanks, Alexis.
In Venezuela, over 5,000 people have died. Another nearly 17,000 have been injured after a set of 2 earthquakes hit the country just a few weeks ago. This comes as the nation is already in the middle of a major political transition, with protesters pushing for free and democratic elections.
Joining us now from Caracas is Phil Gunson. He's the senior analyst for the Andes region at the International Crisis Group. Phil, it's good to talk to you again. First, I want to ask how you and your family are and just how recovery is going right now in Venezuela. Of course, we've been watching all these videos coming out. I know it's getting harder and harder to find survivors. Has any progress been made? How is everyone doing?
Personally, we're fine. Thank you for asking. Our house, fortunately, is built on rock. We're not in the part of the capital, Caracas, that suffered, which is nearer to the mountain and is built mostly on sediment, so that the buildings shake a lot more. More generally, of course, the situation is really challenging. As you mentioned, the official death toll is now around 5,000, but at least that many people must still be under the rubble. And it's very, very challenging because, of course, these are high-rise buildings that basically collapsed, one floor on top of another. So extracting the bodies is a really challenging task. And the recovery, of course, will be an even greater challenge.
I wanted to ask you, from your position as an analyst here, how much faith you put into the numbers that the government gives out here, and you talk about sort of how more widespread the damage might be, the death toll, the number of injured. What is the kind of non-governmental sense of how widespread and difficult the damage has been?
Yeah, I don't really think the government has much motivation for manipulating the figures. This is, of course, a government that has us well used to concealment of statistics, distortion of statistics. But in this particular case, I don't think they want to minimize the disaster. If anything, they need the help and they need to stress just how bad this is. To give you some kind of a more objective figure, perhaps, the UN ordered 10,000 body bags and made it clear that was perhaps roughly the kind of final death toll that they were anticipating. The damage is mostly concentrated in the small coastal state of La Guaira, which is just north of Caracas, on the Caribbean. Buildings did come down in Caracas. There were some deaths and a lot of injuries and property damage in Caracas, but it's mainly down there on the coast that the true disaster happened.
How much international aid are you seeing? I know the U.S. sent a couple of those task force teams that are usually deployed, but a lot of that usually comes through USAID, which we know is currently defunct. I'm wondering what you saw, given the unclear status of the Venezuelan government, who helped and is more needed?
Well, the first few days were really terrible. I think everybody coincides in saying that the initial response, 48 to 72 hours, which of course is the crucial period for getting people out alive, there really was next to no government presence on the ground in the particularly hard-hit area. And when it did appear, it was totally inadequate. Lack of heavy equipment, the rescue crews from civil defense and the firefighters really had no equipment. Even basic stuff like uniforms and boots, they were lacking. And the uniformed security services are accused of basically having stood around, if anything, stood in the way of rescue efforts. There was a large international response. Now, of course, we're into the recovery phase and search and rescue is really over. And those teams have gone back. But there are still field hospitals from many countries that are really acting in an extremely helpful way in dealing with the aftermath of this. Many people, of course, in need of medical attention and even psychological attention.
Yeah.
Phil, I know we want to look at this kind of in complement with the political situation on the ground, and as we kind of make our way there, let me just ask you to contrast for us the way that the government has responded to this crisis with the landslides that we had many years ago now. So Christina asking about international aid. I know that Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, has reached out to the IMF for additional support. Contrast just the level of kind of international aid and outreach she has been able to at least ask for, try to tap this time around versus then, as we've seen the country going through this strange and novel political transition of a sort.
Yeah, it's interesting. 1999, when the last disaster happened in that same area, floods and landslides, killed, again, thousands of people. It was the first year that I was living in Venezuela. It was the first year I was down here as a reporter. And one of the things that really stood out then was the fact that Hugo Chavez, who'd just come to power less than a year earlier, he refused US aid. In fact, he sent back the US naval vessels that were on their way to help out at that point. Of course, now we're in the situation, very strange and paradoxical situation, where since January the 3rd, Venezuela's great, at least over the last couple of decades, great geopolitical rival and adversary, the United States, is now acting in partnership with a rather reluctant Delcy Rodriguez government. But at least that has opened up the country to the possibility of more international aid. And in fact, many countries, not just the United States, but countries that have been very adversarial with countries in some cases with which Venezuela doesn't have any political relations, any diplomatic relations, like Israel, for example, have come in and played an important role in the search and rescue.
I want to ask you about the capacity and kind of the function of this government. There's been some reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere how involved Secretary of State Rubio is over the country's finances, over some of the political apparatus. And then we have this reporting this week that interim president Delcy Rodriguez says she's not sure she's going to run in a future presidential election. Speaking of video, she said she's willing to sit down with opposition leader Maria Corina Machado after U.S. sanctions are lifted on the country. Do we have any idea at this point what the political future looks like for Venezuela?
Well, it's hard to look more than a couple of weeks into the future in this country. Anything can happen. But what we do have right now is an announcement that on the 1st of August, there will be talks beginning between a delegation led by Jorge Rodriguez, the interim president's brother, who heads the National Assembly and has always been, in recent years, the main negotiator for Venezuela, and an opposition delegation. Now, the curious thing is that opposition delegation is not representing Maria Corina Machado, who's clearly the opposition leader. She's outside the country, of course, still. And the US has been very reluctant to have her come back. This opposition delegation is led by a former legislator called Dinora Figuera, in the name of something called the 2015 National Assembly. Back then, there was a parliament in Venezuela that was dominated by the opposition. And the remnants of that, which really don't amount to more than about 20 people, have been the recipients in the recent past, since the Guaido experiment ended with the interim government there, of US recognition to some extent that they're the last democratically elected body. But this is clearly an attempt by the US to, if you like, head off Maria Corina Machado, who has been seen by the Trump administration as excessively confrontational and really not the person who can sit down with the Delcy Rodriguez government, negotiate anything. Of course, we don't know where that process is going or how far and how fast the US will press for a genuine political transition.
Phil Gunson, great to speak with you as always. Thank you very much for the update on the situation there on the ground and for that insight into the political situation in Venezuela as well. Phil Gunson with the International Crisis Group joining us today from Caracas.
Thanks, Phil. Very glad to see that he and his family are doing well. All right, faced with rising expenses, massive student debt, and diminishing job prospects, young investors are taking big risks.
Bloomberg Originals looks at the heightened focus on meme stocks, prediction markets, and crypto young people are using to get ahead.
There are many types of risk, and now even trading is an extreme sport.
In this video, I will start with risking only $100 per trade.
Bro, it's simple. If you can scroll TikTok, you can trade.
You have the fear of missing out on a trade.
And judging by social media, everyone is getting rich.
We're at $232,000.
Just today, I made $16,000.
More young people are investing than ever before, and they're learning about markets in a way no generation has.
Gen Z really is distinct from other age groups. If you go on social media now, you will see a lot of sophisticated trading techniques used in ways that I think no one would have imagined a 20-year-old in 1990, 2000, or even 2010 doing or even knowing about.
I want to show you this trade I'm taking.
A lot of that activity has also broadened to sports gambling, for instance, or trading on prediction markets.
But there are worries that these investors are over-leveraged, taking one too many risks.
I've always been a big risk taker. It's kind of just part of who I am.
3, 2, 1, to the moon! Holy shit. Well, you know what?
Gen Z has a highly differentiated view of risk.
They don't drive, they don't date, they don't drink. On the other hand, they're also this extremely risk-taking generation.
And for many, it's the only path they see to getting ahead.
YOLO stands for you only live once. So YOLO bets would refer to risky investments where the trader has an attitude of, you go big or you go home.
See the rest of that at Bloomberg.com/videos, no doubt.
You involved in meme stocks, Bitcoin?
I am not. I mean, I've covered a lot of these, but I myself have not dabbled in that world. But
I'm pathologically risk averse.
It.
Yeah, I gotta work on it, but mostly I throw things in a high yield savings and call it a day.
That's good. All right. Well, it's reliable.
Maybe some more time at Bloomberg.
Sure.
I'll have confidence in my ability
Christina,
to
and I think it'll happen.
Play the market. Absolutely not going to happen. All right, coming up next, a former diplomat warns that Iran could become like Tony Soprano by extracting money from countries looking to use the Strait of Hormuz. A look at the potential long-term impact on oil prices, that's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Traffic in the Strait of Hormuz is down and oil prices are up after the U.S. reimposed its naval blockade on Iran. Just a handful of tankers are making it through daily compared to an average 21 ships daily in February.
This week we spoke to diplomats, foreign policy and business experts at the Aspen Security Forum to get their view on the state of the Strait. Here's what they told us, starting with former NATO ambassador Nicholas Burns.
The Iranians believe, I think erroneously, that they get to run the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. They get to be the toll keeper, exact fees, establish a fee structure. There's not a government in the world that agrees with that. And I don't see any way that President Trump can ever agree to that. That would mean Iran emerges from this long war of 4.5 months stronger in that respect than when the war began. It would be injurious to the global economy, to insurance companies, to shippers, to people the companies that depend on the free flow of commercial traffic. So I think that the president cannot, and I believe will not give in, our president, on that issue. I don't think the Iranians are going to give in. So where does that leave us? I think a cat and mouse, probably next couple of weeks or months leading into the autumn, where there's a back and forth. They agree to a ceasefire. The ceasefire is honored, then not honored. They go back to exchange of fire. And I think that's where we are because these are hard-bitten, highly ideological leaders in Iran. They think they can play us for time, and so they're testing us. It's very important that President Trump stands up to them in that respect and not give in on issues like Iranians becoming the Tony Soprano of the Strait of Hormuz, exacting tribute from other countries.
I think all eyes right now are on the Strait of Hormuz. The conflict, which had originally been about Iran and Iran's nuclear capabilities, has really necked down to being primarily about the Strait of Hormuz. If you think about it, the agreement that was reached in mid-June was an agreement just on managing the strait in order to get to talks on nuclear capabilities. We never even got there. There wasn't even really time for product markets and crude markets and LNG markets to normalize, and we're back to a situation, as you know, the U.S. announcing that it's going to have a new blockade on Iranian exports and imports that is poised for more escalation in the Hormuz Strait and clearly not a path to normalization there in the near future.
How do you look at this? Is it intractable? Do you think we're kind of stuck, for lack of a better word?
I guess it depends on stuck in the short term. I think it's very hard to imagine that in the next few days, in a week or so, that we'll be at a place of credible normalization. I think even if there is an agreement between the Trump administration, the Iranians, the Omanis, the Pakistanis, which of course people are trying to get to, we are attuned to the fact that Iran is going to try to enhance its position through sporadic disruption of the strait. And that is something that I think is going to have to be accommodated by markets over the medium and long run. We're already seeing that in the sense that you have Gulf countries announcing new investments in infrastructure, ports, pipelines. Over time, the Strait will become less important because people are adapting to the reality that this is a choke point, which is going to be problematic, which doesn't mean catastrophic, but problematic for quite some time.
What does the time horizon look like for that adaptation? So I know that there's been this effort to build more east-west pipelines. When is that going to be something that's a viable kind of competitor to using the Strait to get energy out of the region?
In terms of infrastructure,
Yes.
I mean, the infrastructure can be built maybe quicker than you think, but still we're talking a year or 2 years. And in that interim period, there still is the opportunity for the redundant infrastructure, the infrastructure that is currently taking Saudi oil out of the Gulf, not through the Strait or Emirati oil, that could be disrupted. So that's been one of the most important buffers in the crisis going from, February, March until today, is getting a significant amount of oil out of the Gulf through that alternative infrastructure. We have to hope that infrastructure doesn't become targeted in subsequent rounds. We did see the Houthis kind of come back into the conflict, or at least remind us that they're still potential actors. That, of course, could create new constraints on a market that is very, it's less well positioned, if that's not terrible English, than it was in February to manage a prolonged disruption.
No doubt you've heard the president asked about higher oil prices, and something he says is it could have been much worse, that going into this conflict he was told it could be oil at $200 a barrel, and we never got to that point. Why is that the case? Why have we seen, yes, oil prices spike, but kind of stabilize around the $75 level?
Sure, and he's right. It could have been much worse, and many people expected it to be much worse. And the reality is that we had a massive disruption. The International Energy Agency has called it, rightly, the largest supply disruption in history. And what is striking is that that didn't translate into an economic massive global disruption because the system was more resilient than many, including me and many other analysts, expected. And there were a whole number of reasons why that was the case. I would say there are three that are very, very important. The first is the redundant infrastructure, the fact that there were ways of getting a significant amount of the disrupted oil out of the Gulf without using the Strait. That was very important. Secondly was the use of strategic oil reserves. So, of course, as you know, in the 1970s, after the big disruptions in Middle Eastern oil, then you had the establishment around the world of global strategic reserves. And the IEA, the International Energy Agency, coordinated the largest ever release of those reserves, so 400 million barrels. And that really helped ease some of the pain. About 5 or 6 million barrels of oil a day were brought on global markets from those reserves. And then lastly, most surprisingly, is the role that China played. So China actually curbed its demand for oil on the global market. It didn't stop consuming oil, but it stopped building its reserve, which it had been doing for some time, and started using its reserve. It put a restriction on the export of product markets, so it had more product inside of China. And overall, Chinese demand for globally traded oil came down by almost 4 million barrels a day. So those three things were really important, along with the fact that the market was oversupplied when this all started. Now, I'll end on an important point, which is that I am nervous that because the global system managed the disruption of the last 5 months better than I think almost any of us could have expected, there might be a complacency, thinking, well, we can continue to manage it that way. The oil market is in a different situation today in July than it was in February, March, and some of those buffers have been whittled down to the point where, we can't be so confident that we can manage a similarly sized disruption for a prolonged period of time.
So much of your work focuses on geopolitics and how companies experience that and are exposed to it. And I want to ask you about what's going on in the Middle East. So we've reached this point where the president's proposing a 20% tariff effectively on ships going through the Strait of Hormuz if the U.S. offers protection. Take us into the minds of executives, how they're thinking about what's happening here. Obviously, traffic is not back to what it was before the war began. What are they considering? What's top of mind for them?
I mean, I think right now executives are trying to find some sort of a backup plan. And for those that were almost entirely reliant on goods that were being shipped through the Strait of Hormuz, it's not that straightforward. There's been overland shipment for some companies that have tried to move goods over land borders. There's now talks of new canals being dug, which is obviously not a rapid solution. But I think if we learned anything from COVID and the issues between U.S. and China and now the Strait of Hormuz, that reliance issue that companies have to understand a fallback in the event of a choke point like this being used, that is the priority. For some, there's not really an answer. But that risk just creates a true threat for these businesses going forward.
Talk a bit more about that, the way that COVID kind of shaped their outlook on supply chains and how we're seeing that in effect here with what's happening in the Middle East.
Well, and not to parrot the president, but people didn't really talk about supply chains as much before you realized, well, wait a minute, all these things come from China and all the raw materials we use for pharma, for other things came from China. We, take that a couple years forward, rare earths and the 27-odd rare earths that China began banning from the U.S., I mean, the U.S. was almost entirely reliant on them. So I think the awareness of how stuff works, how supply chains work, and trying to diversify that reliance, there's a huge focus on that, obviously in the U.S. government, but also amongst my clients that are trying to find alternative suppliers to really diversify away from a scenario where they could be held hostage.
In reverse order, that's Dan Tannebaum, Meghan O'Sullivan, and Nicholas Burns.
All right, coming up, who was the real Wolf of Wall Street? It's the focus of a new mini-series based on Bloomberg reporting. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura. All right, we all know the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, the Martin Scorsese film starring Leonardo DiCaprio as convicted felon and Wall Street broker Jordan Belfer. But how much of that film is real and how much of it is Hollywood magic? So a new docuseries called The Real Wolf of Wall Street digs into just that.
You know the truth about Jordan Belfort? He was never called the Wolf of Wall Street.
No one ever called Jordan Wolf. The movie doesn't even accurately portray the level of insanity that occurred. What's missing from the movie is that there is a price to pay.
In real life, he destroyed people's lives. People lost money. People got hurt.
And this docuseries is based on our own Jason Leopold's reporting. Jason, you're our senior investigative reporter. So what prompted this?
During the 90s, white-collar crimes were not really given lots of attention by federal investigators. It was lots of slaps on the wrist that were taking place then. But here we are now, in this time, where you're kind of getting a sense of history, kind of, seeing it repeat itself. Certainly in the world of crypto, prediction markets, the loosening of regulations that are supposed to protect investors. So it felt like the right moment. And ultimately what this, docuseries is, what The Real Wolf of Wall Street is an opportunity for the people who worked with Jordan Belfort. They certainly challenged the narrative of the film of The Wolf of Wall Street and what Jordan, had wrote about in his book and what was on screen. But it's also kind of a warning about, it could happen all over again.
I remember watching it and thinking I knew nothing about penny stocks when I watched it. And I was very fascinated by that and the lack of regulation around that, which kind of led into everything. But did the company start off as a fraudulent scheme? And if not, how did it become that? And what did you learn from talking to these employees?
It didn't start out like that. I mean, ultimately, Jordan Belfort took over Stratton Oakmont and turned it into what became this boiler room brokerage firm that was known for pump and dumps, pumping up these stocks and then just kind of dumping it and leaving investors holding the bag. I have to say that was essentially kind of the business model for what they were doing. There was nothing really legitimate or essentially legal about these investments that were taking place. What's incredible about some of the documents that I'm now sharing with the public and I wrote about in my newsletter, FOIA Files, on Friday, is the additional details that it shows, the level of sophistication that went into these frauds, the moving of money, the laundering of money. There's one document that I centered on that showed that because Belfort and Stratton Oakmont was bringing in tens of millions of dollars, that illegally they needed to figure out ways to kind of wash the money or move the money.
Make it look legitimate.
And there was an instance in which Jordan Belfort went to Atlantic City and wanted to turn cash into casino chips. And this was Trump's casino in Atlantic City. And but he wouldn't sign this cash transaction report, or refused to provide the identification that goes along with it. So there's just an incredible level of sophistication that, for those who are following, what's taking place now, may look a little familiar.
Has the regulatory environment gotten any better? Do you fear that when you romanticize a character like this, it just leads to more imitation and more fraud and more abuse in the markets?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the regulatory restrictions that were put into place to protect investors, ever since not just Stratton Oakmont and Jordan Belfort, but WorldCom, Enron, you name it. You may imagine if you could recall some of the perp walks that took place. That we all watched on news. So there were some, real strong regulatory restrictions and protections that were put into place, but now they've been loosened, right? I mean, one of President Donald Trump's policy positions is to kind of loosen regulatory, guidelines and policies, kind of across the federal government, and that holds true really for crypto and at the Securities and Exchange Commission as well. So it's the bar is kind of getting lower in terms of the movie itself. I mean, one thing to note is that this movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, is a hugely popular movie. I mean, it regularly ranks in the top 10 on the streaming platform, Paramount Plus and other streaming platforms that carry it. So Jordan Belfort himself is an influencer now. He gives motivational speeches. So he has been idolized by people out there, his followers and others. And so, I mean, I think that there are dangers in that, and in terms of, just how attractive making money is to people, and doing so in not, maybe in ways that are sort of cutting corners.
Thanks so much, Jason. All right, you are watching Bloomberg This Weekend. The 9 a.m. hour starts right now.
Coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, stocks end the week lower after a surprise breakthrough from a Chinese startup fuels fears America's AI lead is shrinking. Xi Jinping promises AI for all at a summit in Shanghai.
The use cases of AI are only limited by your imagination. So how about a ride on this funky robot vehicle?
Plus, new U.S. strikes near the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. Iran says the U.S. is targeting bridges, tunnels, and other civilian infrastructure. This morning, Tehran threatening a full-scale retaliation.
And more than 100 million Americans are under air quality alerts because of smoke from Canadian wildfires that have led President Trump to threaten Canada with new tariffs, what it means for the grid and for the World Cup.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. We are coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
And I'm David Gura with Alexis Christoforous, who is in for Lisa Mateo on this Saturday, July the 18th. A lot of news this morning. The president in our general vicinity. He's in New Jersey ahead of this World Cup championship match, which is scheduled for tomorrow. And it does seem like there are fewer particulates in the air. The wildfire smoke is less than it was yesterday, and FIFA saying that game is going to go ahead as planned.
I mean, obviously, I left before the sun came up, which exacerbates the issue, but it did feel better this morning while I was outside waiting for my cab. And yesterday it was a little bit better, but it was a big issue. They really didn't have a contingency plan because this is the big finale, and everybody's rearing to go. We're going to talk about it tomorrow, and we've got some good guests coming up on that as well. But of course, we also have to talk about the news of the day. And our colleagues in Asia were at this really amazing tech summit where China unveiled their new AI competitor that obviously had implications on the markets here. And then Iran, there's more strikes overnight, and Schrodinger's Strait, yet again. Is it open? Is it closed? We're going to talk about it.
We're going to embrace that term. I should say we can't claim creating it, but we use it an awful lot. All right, let's get the headlines here first with Alexis Christoforous. Alexis, over to you.
And we're going to start there. Thanks, guys. The U.S. and Iran exchanged strikes for the 7th straight night, this time aimed at infrastructure and military targets as their battle over the Strait of Hormuz intensifies. Iran's army says it's hit U.S. assets in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait in response to the latest U.S. strikes. A top Iranian military advisor warns the U.S. could face a full-scale offensive in the coming days if its barrage continues through the weekend. Meantime, catastrophic flash floods in Texas have killed at least 2 people and left hundreds more in need of rescue. In Uvalde County, months' worth of rain has fallen in a span of just days. This man says floodwaters rushed through his home twice this week.
There was maybe about 2 inches on this concrete slab, water. So it didn't look like it was getting any better. And I could mark it off. There's no more fence, but when the fence was there prior, I could mark it off and I knew it was rising.
Rain has eased across parts of Texas, but officials warn the danger is far from over, and they say the risk of isolated tornadoes remains. Taylor Farms is voluntarily removing some of its iceberg lettuce from the U.S. market after it was linked to a parasitic illness. The California farm says the iceberg lettuce was sourced from a farm in central Mexico. Taco Bell has also removed effective lettuce from its restaurants and supply chain amid the outbreak. Nearly 7,000 cases of the foodborne illness are being investigated nationwide, with Michigan reporting the highest number of cases. Poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of the Canadian wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup finale at MetLife Stadium. And President Trump will be there as Argentina looks to defend its title against Spain. The president praised FIFA at a World Cup reception yesterday at Trump Tower in New York City.
I want to congratulate every team that made the 2026 World Cup one of the all-time greatest sporting events in history. And I think beyond a sporting event, this has been not just a sporting event. This has been far beyond a sporting event. This has been something very, very special.
Mr. Trump is expected to deliver that World Cup trophy to the winning team on the field along with FIFA's president after the match. And you know what that means, guys? Lots and lots of traffic.
Yes, lots of traffic. And I've walked by Penn Station during the course of the tournament to see the kind of infrastructure that they've created to get people onto those New Jersey Transit trains is something to...
How is it looking?
Does it look good?
People are playing along. It looks kind of nuts to my eye.
They do this interesting thing in the city where they shut down all these lanes for buses to go to the World Cup.
Right.
But it's still unclear to me what buses, and it's unclear to the NYPD as well. I keep asking them, what is this for? And they're like, we don't know. We're just blocking off the street.
Yes, reinforcing the fact that MetLife Stadium is in the middle of nowhere.
Right. Doesn't help.
No, it's all right.
Thank you, Alexis.
We're almost there. We're almost there.
Appreciate it. One more game. All right. This morning, Iran says the United States struck a desalination plant in the southern part of the country, leaving 20 villages without water. As Alexis mentioned, the intensification comes on the 7th night of attacks. Bridges and tunnels also targeted.
Bloomberg White House correspondent Josh Wingrove is in New Jersey, where the president is waking up this morning. Josh, where is the president's head on all this? What have you heard from White House officials? Is there a plan, or is this the new normal for the foreseeable future?
Well, they're keeping it ambiguous. There's some reporting that he's considering ramping up options. Accuses, for instance, reporting that they've moved air tankers back into the region to prepare for a potential escalation of airstrikes. So he seems to be keeping options on the table, but where we'll see that go, we don't know. As you know, we have always been on guard on weekends in particular. It seems like that's really when the American attacks seem to peak up. So, we'll see if we see something later today. It's too soon to say. I think more broadly, as we've discussed before, the president sort of has been de-emphasizing this in his remarks and kind of appears, frankly, focusing on other things right now. And we've seen this before, of course, with Ukraine as well. He sort of got bored of talking about that and has focused on other things. And so right now, we just continue to be watching this day by day, and there's no kind of end in sight. And it's unclear when, if at all, talks may resume or talks for talks may resume. We just start continuing to watch it bit by bit.
Talking about the talks.
Talking about the talks.
Very diplomatic.
Under the category of other things the president is watching or cares about, there is the Run, Darlene, Run matter. His embrace of Lindsey Graham's sister, now the interim senator from the state of South Carolina, the president in a post on Truth Social encouraging her to put her hat in the ring for the primary to get the seat permanently. What do you make of this? I confess, I didn't know much about Lindsey Graham's sister before she was elevated to this position,
same.
But the president emphasizing his long relationship with her, his confidence in her. How is the president looking at her prospects and the importance of this race in particular, Josh?
President likes loyalty in senators, and in her speech when she became a senator, she talked about the importance of upholding his agenda. So if she's a trusted ally, it's perhaps not a surprise that the president, who is of course primaried or supported the primaries against a couple members of his current Senate conference, would value that. And so if he's with his endorsement, I think he is sort of taking a bird in hand approach with taking, backing her. And his endorsements have, of course, been very influential, if not decisive, across, basically every state over the course of this cycle. And I think that's important to remember too, because, in other countries, maybe ones that are having trade tensions or whatnot, you're starting to see people look over the horizon, right? Oh, well, Trump will be gone in 2.5 years and we can weather the storm until then and this and that. And maybe the Republican Party will shift. President Trump will continue to have a very, very strong influence over the party, over its primaries, over the actions its leaders take, whether he's president or not, for quite some time. And so I think we're seeing that with this. And there's some reporting that other major candidates are now sort of reconsidering or still considering whether they will jump into the race, because running against a Trump-endorsed candidate would be a significantly uphill battle.
Josh, since you are our senior Canadian correspondent, I do want to go back to...
I'm sorry about the smoke.
Of course you just did that.
Did you guys plan that? I feel like that was a plan.
No.
I get so many texts,
Even though I'm still upset that David went to Aspen without me, he did talk to Jamieson Greer there to talk about the trade policies. In the last hour, we were talking about kind of the incrementalism of having to negotiate one-on-one with all these countries the way they're trying to do this next round of tariffs. And the president is now threatening new tariffs on Canada because of the wildfires. He posted, Canada has refused to engage in basic forest management and debris removal. Sounds familiar to what he said with California last year, knowing that such refusal will lead to exactly this result. This is willful negligence that's capitalized and becoming a yearly occurrence costing the United States billions of dollars, which cost of this pollution must of necessity be added to the tariffs Canada is currently paying.
It's a complicated clause, by the way.
Yes, that's not easy to read. That's my second time, and I did no better the second time. Josh, what is going on here? Does the president really need another foreign policy fight, especially one that could impact how much Americans pay for things, including cars and other items that come across the border?
I mean, the notion of Canada, vacuuming the floor of its boreal forest or whatever. I mean, obviously, that's always so much you can do. To take this seriously, though, I mean, a Canadian national died fighting a forest fire this month in Colorado. This long-standing cooperation between these two countries. In those infamous California fires, it was Canadian water bombers you saw. Some of the stuff Trump says goes off the back of Canada and Canadians. Other stuff they find particularly insulting. And I think this risks being in that second bucket because the country has spent so much time helping America fight its forest fires that, the notion that this is sort of like their fault. I mean, no one wants to smoke over it. It's over Canada too, of course, is I think going to prompt some blowback, frankly, is already prompting blowback from Canadian officials. And so whether we see this factor into these negotiations or whatever is unclear. Just to remember where we are on this, most of the trade between Canada and the US right now is tariff-free because it's exempted under CUSMA, or as the Canadians call it, and USMCA after the Americans call it. And so Trump could adjust that exemption. That's a big fear of industries in the US and in Canada. He could raise the baseline tariff through these 301 investigations, one of which is done, one of which is still in the hopper. Mm-hmm. Or he could try to adjust the sectoral tariffs to crank up tariffs on autos or steel, which are the two ones that are biting the Canadian economy in particular. So he does have avenues here if he wants, but it's also true that Canada has one of the lowest effective tariff rates in the world right now when it comes to accessing the US market. And so if the price of that is looking the other way when the president gets upset every now and then, maybe that's what the Canadians are going to do.
CUSMA, as it's called.
CUSMA is what they call it.
Running out of bandwidth for acronyms.
Ambassador Greer did use USMCA.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I bet. I bet he did. Yeah, I'm mad at you, David. You made a lot of news in that interview.
Well,
you complicated my evening.
I'm sorry for that.
We're all mad at him. We'll unite forces. See, these Canadians and Americans are getting along well in our bitterness about your Aspen trip. Thanks, Josh.
Wingrove at the beginning of pool duty in New Jersey. Thank you very much for the time.
All right, the announcement of a powerful new AI model from Chinese startup Moonshot roiled markets on Friday.
Tech stocks specifically, semiconductors finished lower over concerns that the U.S. may be losing ground in the global AI race.
Earlier today, we spoke with Bloomberg's Mike Shepard and Minmin Lo about China's push to become the new AI leader.
It's definitely an important priority for the Chinese government. In fact, they are grooming this entire AI sector as the next big export engine for China as the country transitions away from older industries like property, which is really in a big slump for several years now. So they're pouring a lot of investments to provide the patient capital to groom all these startups in this sector. And it's all part of the 5-year plan that China had laid out early this year, right, in March at the 2 sessions. They have a AI Plus plan where they want to encourage adoption of AI across all sectors of the economy over the next decade or so. And just to give you a sense of how important AI is, this World AI Conference in Shanghai is in the 9th edition. And I remember in the early years, not many journalists would even bother attending, but now it's a completely different story. Even President Xi himself came to town to grace the event personally. And this really represents an upgrade to the status of this event, which in the last 2 years, it was attended by Premier Li Qiang, who is the number 2 leader in China. And President Xi gave this big speech this year. A lot of it was, of course, also a veiled message to the U.S. as well, because he talked about how, when it comes to AI governance, the world needs to take a multilateral approach. The world needs to learn from one another, and AI development shouldn't be a solo development of one country. And all over Chinese state media, you look at the Communist Party mouthpiece, People's Daily, they have been publishing editorials about how tech and AI should not become a monopoly. It should really be treated as a global public good that is shared with the rest of the world. So again, President Xi positioning himself as this leader of the global South, advocating for bridging the digital divide. So he announced a few key initiatives, including offering at least 5,000 training opportunities in AI for people in the developed countries and allowing them, some 30 countries, to tap into this AI-powered meteorological system to safeguard their homes, for example. So really, and also, yes, a couple of days ago, there were some 29 countries who signed up to be part of this China-led group called the World AI Cooperation Organization. And it's just yet another platform that could give China more sway in shaping global AI norms.
Mike, how does this impact American companies? I mean, obviously, they're already down the road with a lot of these investments. They can't claw them back at this point, but they have to be looking at this and being very concerned. Is there a way for them to pivot? And then you also have the Trump administration starting to talk about having a new regulatory agency specifically for AI. Does that compound the difficulties American AI companies could now face?
Well, take the second part first there, Christina, because it's the latest, and it was a scoop from last night from our team here in D.C. And the companies actually would welcome some sort of a coherent approach to AI safety reviews. And at issue is, they did not like the way that Anthropic's Fable 5 and Mythos 5 were essentially ordered off the market via export controls over concerns that the guardrails on them weren't adequate. And we saw the same sort of pressure put on OpenAI. But the companies had felt that it was overboard and also kind of ad hoc in the approach. And they would like to see a more coherent framework. And what's taking shape is, a FINRA-like model, one that would resemble what the broker-dealer industry on Wall Street faces, that it's an industry funded and not industry run, but industry certainly has a lot of input to how the rules of the road are set. And in this case, it would be the safety testing. And that would give them a little bit more of, I guess, a clear path forward when it comes to dealing with the government and how far they can take their models as they develop them. More broadly, though, the question of how companies are reading this moment. Look, many of them are playing the long game. And all this week, we heard from TSMC. They were reporting, look, we are seeing demand for AI chips and AR hardware going through 2030. It is going to be hard to meet. And that is a message that was echoed by SK Hynix during Ed Ludlow's interview with the CEO just a little more than a week ago, as they were making their public market debut here in the U.S. And that it's a message that's been reinforced by NVIDIA Chief Executive Officer Jensen Huang. They just see the demand from hyperscalers here in the U.S. and even elsewhere as being off the charts. And NVIDIA also caught a bit of a break, and some of the other American companies caught a break too, with the declassification of the United Arab Emirates, which is trying to establish itself as a real center of development for AI. And they see that as a new market that they can break into and try to export the American tech stack. But really, you see this contrast of visions, though. Xi Jinping laying out something that is very multilateral, and President Donald Trump arguing one that is very much America first. And it really doesn't have all the pieces together in the same way that you do see China putting on the table now.
Just looking at that sell-off, you saw NVIDIA lose a lot of ground yesterday and Apple gaining a lot of ground. These two companies with huge market caps really vying for top spot there.
Look at that dot meet in the middle there.
Yeah,
My
we got
goodness.
earnings coming up here, so we'll see what happens here in the weeks ahead.
All right, and coming up, does the Iran war pose a political liability for Republicans this fall? We're going to hear from Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Trump is blaming Canada for smoke from ongoing wildfires that drifted into the U.S. In a Truth Social post yesterday, the president accused Canada of, quote, willful negligence in forest management. He said the economic cost of the pollution should be added to tariffs on Canadian imports. Poor air quality in the New York, New Jersey area because of those wildfires is expected to improve by tomorrow, just in time for the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium. You're seeing a live picture of the stadium right there when Argentina is going to defend its title against Spain. President Trump plans on attending that match and presenting the World Cup trophy to the winning team. Looks like it's snowing there right now. Maybe that has something to do with the air quality. All right. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is considering firing his commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but only if he can find a suitable replacement. The Financial Times reports that the head of the Ukrainian army has sparked protests, which intensified after Zelensky dismissed his defense minister. Zelensky is reportedly taking the weekend to interview candidates for the position of commander-in-chief. And the beaches of Normandy, where Allied forces landed on D-Day in World II, could land UNESCO World Heritage status. The storming of those 5 beaches was the start of a long and bloody campaign that ultimately defeated Nazi Germany. The World Heritage Committee meets in Busan, South Korea for 11 days, beginning tomorrow. Christina and David.
All right, thanks, Alexis. All right, President Trump notified Congress a week ago that America is again at war with Iran, which restarts that 60-day clock on using military power in the region without congressional approval.
We spoke to Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut who sits on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, about his view of how the war in Iran is going, and he was blunt, calling the war disastrous and the negotiations incompetent.
This is the most significant foreign policy disaster in the last 20 years. Iran effectively has control of the Strait. They are going to have control of the Strait for the long run. As a price of opening that Strait, they want all of the sanctions released, which is going to put a lot of new money into their economy, but also allow them to send money out to their proxy groups in the region. This war should have never started. It's hard to figure out what to do now because it's kind of like asking somebody, now that the raw egg is splattered over the floor, how do you put it back together. But it seems as if the United States is going to have to pay that VIG, billions of dollars to Iran in sanctions relief, and we're going to have to prevail upon the Israelis to permanently stop the war with Lebanon. And if those two things happen, maybe we can get that strait reopened. I have no confidence that ultimately there's going to be any bigger deal between the United States and Iran. I don't think they're going to make any commitments on the nuclear program. So I guess the best we can ask for right now is to just stop the shooting, get the strait reopened, and we're still seemingly a far away from that.
As we look at Humpty Dumpty there on the floor, do you think the administration gets that? Are they still confident that they can stare down Iran, I guess, and find some solution by doing that?
Yeah, I think we sort of can't overhype the degree that just plain old incompetence plays in this story. I mean, the Trump administration doesn't know what it's doing. Its primary diplomats with Iran are the president's son-in-law and a guy who was a real estate developer 2 seconds ago who's never done diplomacy. So it's not surprising that they're failing. They're going to either have to put actual adults, like experienced diplomats, in charge, or they're just going to have to step out of the way and ask our European friends or our Gulf friends to come in and, try to seal an ultimate deal on reopening the strait. So I have very little confidence that this crowd that's in charge of our national security is going to be able to get anything done.
We've seen in recent weeks your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, many of them expressing more reservations about this. Do you detect a real change kind of in their position as this is attenuated, as it plays out?
I mean, this is, of course, a deeply unpopular war. The American people don't support the war. They want it to end, and they're paying the price, not just in higher gas prices and higher diesel prices and higher fertilizer prices, but also in the cost to the budget. This is $100 billion to $200 billion. And what is going to happen is that Republicans are going to cut funding for schools, for transportation, for nutrition, in order to pay for the war. That's part of the reason that the American public don't want it. So as you get closer to the election, this becomes an issue that Republicans are going to have to deal with, because this will be an issue where voters are going to say, are you for the war or against it? And it's going to matter in their choices. So yes, I expect that you will get more Republicans saying, time to end the war. For the first time ever, about 3 weeks ago, we passed a resolution in the Senate to end the war. It ultimately was stymied by some procedural moves in the Senate, but there is evidence that Republicans are starting to wake up.
You mentioned Israel a moment ago, and I go back to that memo of understanding, which it seems was not worth the paper that it was printed on. I think the president would agree with that now. Israel, of course, not a party to those conversations, and I'm curious how you look at the U.S.'s power to persuade Israel to scale back, pull back its campaign in Lebanon, and change tack.
I think you'll have to use the leverage that we have, and the leverage that we have is our defense relationship. So long as Israel believes that the Trump administration is going to continue to feed them the weapons and the intelligence that they need to carry out war on Lebanon, they're going to continue to carry out that war. That's a very blunt tool. It took me a long time to accept it as a tool to try to influence their behavior in Gaza. But if it is a precondition to getting the strait open, then we have to consider using that tool, because as long as the strait is closed, it is American citizens, families, that are bearing the cost.
Let's talk a bit about that. Pull to domestic politics here, and you mentioned it's a deeply unpopular war. How do you see that playing out in the months ahead, and how do you and your fellow Democrats kind of maybe capitalize is not the right word to use there, but highlight the fact that it's as unpopular as it is with the electorate?
What I found in my time in politics is that most of the time foreign policy doesn't matter in elections until it's sometimes the only thing that matters. And I do think that this election, it's going to be on the ballot. Even if Trump were to get the strait reopened today, the cost of a gallon of gasoline or fertilizer is not going to come down to any reasonable level by November. So it will be a voting issue, and the president's foreign policy incompetence. And that agreement you mentioned, that ceasefire agreement, was just an example of incompetence, right? He signed an agreement committing Israel to do something without Israel at the table. He apparently by accident signed an agreement that actually gave control of the strait permanently to Iran. His foreign policy disasters are, I think, going to be relevant this November.
I had Ambassador Rahm Emanuel here earlier, and he really seemed to welcome having this debate about U.S.-Israel relations going into the midterms and the general election on the heels of that. Do you likewise? I mean, there's a lot of ink being spilled here about the degree to which there's division in the Democratic Party. There's debate about Israel, how healthy that might be. Where do you fall on that?
Well, I mean, broadly, I don't think you're a healthy party unless you're having debate, unless you have division. Part of the reason that the Republican Party is about to get their clock cleaned in this election is that they don't have any division.
You're confident of that?
I am pretty confident of that. I mean, they're going to try to cheat their way to a win, but I'm confident that if it's a free and fair election, Democrats are going to do very well. Yeah, I think in a healthy political party, you have debate, and we certainly do have a debate in the Democratic Party about what to do with Israel. I mean, I'm somebody that wants a strong U.S. relationship with Israel. I do believe in the preservation and protection of a Jewish state in the Middle East. What Netanyahu is doing is not serving that objective. He is actually, in the long run, going to end up recruiting more enemies of Israel, both terrorist enemies and, frankly, countries that don't support Israel's existence through his conduct in both Gaza and in Lebanon. That's why I think we have to use blunt tools to get his policy to change.
You know, it was interesting over the course of this conference, not
mincing
words there, but how many people were just sort of hyper-focused on this conflict. And it's interesting, we'll hear from this interview I did with Secretary Esper tomorrow, but, you know, a lot of concern just about what the strategic plan going forward could be. So yes, there's this blockade in place. How sustainable is it to have that in the Strait of Hormuz in perpetuity? And we've talked a lot about resources, but that's something a number of guests brought up during the course of those 3 days.
Is it because it just seems so amorphous and they're just not sure what the goal is, especially at this point, like how it ends?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the first day that I was there, we had the president announcing these 20% tariffs he was proposing on ships, and then he took that off just a couple of hours later. And it was interesting to be in a forum like that where there were so many policymakers, past and present, like all of us, just trying to track where this was headed, and it did feel very amorphous.
Were these bipartisan concerns?
Absolutely. You know, I think that there's not an absence of optimism on both sides, but I think there's a sense that really the MOU, the Memo of Understanding, isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. Ceasefire's dead, go back to the table, but how do you convince the Iranians to go back to the table at this point in time? And really, what are those conversations
There's not a lot of leverage
like?
left.
Very little leverage.
Exactly right.
I also spoke to Senator Murphy on Thursday, hours before President Trump addressed the nation, and talked a lot about the prospects of there being election interference and malfeasance. He made those claims of Chinese election interference. Here's what he had to say about that.
The danger is that we, for the first time in American history, don't have a free election. I don't know what the president is going to recommend, but if he is trying to build the case to put troops out in the polling places, he will likely be stopped by the Supreme Court, and then we will see whether our democracy collapses and he does not listen to the decision of the Supreme Court. This is a really dangerous moment, and I'm really worried that so many of my Republican colleagues are quiet about it. You know, their party is a cult right now, and I am just still hopeful that some of my Republican colleagues will stand up and when they hear his speech tonight, call it out for what it likely will be, the most significant rhetorical attack on democracy on the national airwaves that has ever been made in the history of the country.
You have a new book out, Crisis for the Common Good, and a lot of the counsel in that book is just for us to come together more through clubs and activities and kind of re-engage with the way things used to be. Not wholly leaning on nostalgia, but that's a part of it here. I could ask if you're running for president. I expect you to demur on that. But let me ask you sort of how you see the future of the Democratic Party here vis-a-vis that text, or just how you're thinking about the way your party should take shape here going to the next election.
Yeah, I mean, I want my party to recognize that, you know, there's not just an economic crisis in this country, there's a spiritual crisis. People are feeling less meaning and purpose in their lives. They're feeling more disconnected from their family, from their community than ever before. We've got to sort of preach a gospel of happiness about how people can wake up every day and feel like they have real dignity and meaning in their work, how we can control these technologies that are sending their kids into lives of isolation. Our party sometimes, you know, solves very technical problems like the price of a prescription drug, but doesn't explain to people how that's actually going to make them happier. If we were to lead this November and 2 years from now with a really aggressive plan on how to control the ravages of social media and AI, a space that, by the way, is open to the Democratic Party right now. Like, parents don't know which party to pick if they want to protect their children from AI. That would speak to families in a spiritual way because they feel like they're losing control of their lives at the hands of these new technologies. That's the conversation my book is trying to start in the party.
Thinking of running?
I mean, I think it's a little too early because we're not even sure that we're going to have a democracy in 2028. So let's make sure that we have a free and fair election in 2026, and then we'll all make our decisions for 2028.
Senator Murphy, thank you very much.
You know, David, we ask a lot of people that question. That's a new answer on me.
That's a new answer, yes. No, he has a kind of sobering sense of the state of the democracy in this country. I should say, I talked to Rahm Emanuel, who was there as well. He's kind of making some steps in that direction, too.
I think definitely, yeah.
So a handful of those folks there at the Aspen Security Forum. Coming up Sunday on Bloomberg This Weekend, we're going to have some live interviews with Republican Congressman Marlon Stutzman of Indiana. Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire is going to join us as well, Christina, on the heels of a day when we see a lot of attacks that Ukraine is waging on Russia right now, some dramatic attacks via drone that look pretty
That's
extraordinary.
Right. President Zelensky has posted a montage video of smoke rising over different parts inside Russia. We'll have to see what the damage assessment is. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. But it's really significant, and as we've discussed, changing the trajectory of the war.
Yeah.
Coming up next, colleges are cracking down on technology and its use of AI. The Dean of the University of Chicago Law School joins us next. That's on Bloomberg This Weekend. We're on your radio, your TV, and of course, the Bloomberg Business app. We'll be right back. Stick with us.
Thanks for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Alexis Christoforous. Let's update you on today's top stories. Apple and the U.S. Justice Department are in early talks about settling a 2024 lawsuit that alleges the iPhone maker violated antitrust laws. Bloomberg reports there's no guarantee the two sides will reach an agreement. The U.S. government accused Apple of monopolizing the market for high-end smartphones by blocking super apps and discouraging outside messaging solutions. On Wall Street, it was another rough week for chip makers as traders continue to rotate out of those stocks on worries that the artificial intelligence spending spree is becoming harder to justify. A key industry gauge, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, fell into a bear market, sinking 20% from its June record. For the week, the tech-heavy NASDAQ fell nearly 2.7%. SpaceX shares tumbled again yesterday, wiping out more than $1 trillion in market value after the company aborted a launch of its Starship rocket because of an engine issue. Despite the recent sell-off, Wall Street remains largely bullish on SpaceX. More than 80% of Bloomberg-tracked analysts rate the stock a buy equivalent, and the average price target suggests about 90% upside from current levels. Round 3 of the British Open is underway at the Royal Birkdale Golf Club in Southport, England. Ryan Fox and Lucas Herbert are at the top of the leaderboard, both at 8 under par. And the match will go on. Soccer's governing body says the World Cup final tomorrow between Argentina and Spain is not under any threat despite the air quality warnings in the New York, New Jersey area because of the Canada wildfires. Meteorologists expect the weather to improve by tomorrow's game at MetLife. Back over to David and Christina.
Live shot of that stadium there for our TV viewers. Parking lot's empty now. It's going to fill up.
Who's
really
your team,
fast.
Alexis? Who are you going for?
You know what? I'm going to go Spain.
Okay, all right.
I'm going
Christina,
Spain. I mean, it'd be cool to see a back-to-back win for Argentina, but I got to go Spain.
I'm going to be Switzerland, and I'm not going to
Okay,
pick.
they're
I'm just
neutral.
going to
Looking forward
watch
to
the
that
game.
third place game, I guess. All right, Alexis, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Last week, the University of Chicago Law School announced that it would be banning laptops, tablets, and iPhones, other smartphones, in an attempt to limit the use of AI tools in the classroom. The school states that the decision was designed to ensure that students learn how to think critically, solve legal problems with sound professional judgment.
This comes at a time where cheating is being investigated at several schools and universities across the country. Students are coming in with near perfect scores on exams that traditionally brought in very different results. Joining us now is the Dean of the Law School at the University of Chicago, Adam Chilton. Adam, thank you for making time. What prompted this, and how big of a problem is this kind of AI crutch or even flat out cheating for students now?
So I am unaware of any of the AI cheating scandals happening at our law school. I haven't heard of any, and I haven't seen any, although I've heard some of the news stories that you're probably referring to that have been taking place at colleges across the country. Our concern is a little different than that, which is the newest frontier models like Fable are just absolutely fantastic. And it's not to say there's never hallucinations or there's never mistakes, but these are models that now can get near perfect scores on the bar exam or on law school final or on other tests and legal benchmarking tools. So the question as educators that we have to be asking ourselves is the students that we're admitting today are going to be graduating in 3 years in a world in which AI models can answer standard legal questions extremely well. And what then is the value that human lawyers are going to have beyond what the AI is able to do? And so what we're most focused on is ensuring that our students have the skills to be the best possible lawyers while graduating into that market.
So let's look at this in two ways. I guess there's kind of use of technology in the classroom, and then there's the use of AI for the kind of work that your graduates are going to be doing, yes, in 3 years' time and beyond that. Maybe I can start there and just ask you how transformative AI has been so far in the profession, and sort of how it's altering the prospects, yes, for jobs that your graduates could get, but also just the kind of need that firms are going to have for graduates of a law school like the University of Chicago's to do legal work going forward.
Sure. So we spent a lot of time over the last year working with our alumni and top law firms to try to understand what they're already seeing and what they're already doing. And the legal profession is already changing quite dramatically. There's both the standard AI tools like ChatGPT or Claude, but a whole range of models that are designed specifically for legal tasks, like Harvey or Gura, and a range of other companies that are competing in this space. And at law firms, the pressure is real from clients to try to find ways to use these tools to be more efficient. And many of the tasks that first, second, third year associates, new lawyers would do, are exactly the kinds of things that AI models are extremely good at. So for instance, go through the whole set of depositions for a trial and try to identify all of the places where a particular topic was covered. AI can do that in seconds. Or go through past contracts and find similar contract language that had been used in other deals and see how it compares to the contract that you're working today. It's marking up. Those sorts of things, companies can take their database of past contracts, past briefs, past memos, and work with it pretty efficiently with AI. So this is already happening. And 201, the law firms that we talk to, are just trying to do more to accelerate that process.
It's a little bit similar to our business because tasks like that, they are what you get, when you go in the door. And for news, when we were starting out as an intern, there was no software that could transcribe tapes for you. So yes, you had to have a bunch of people in there to type out these tapes. And it's annoying and it takes forever, but you also learn so much by listening to these really experienced colleagues do interviews over and over again. You do absorb that. And I imagine it's the same thing when you're asked to go through case law or go through contracts. There is a learning process that you're getting there. So how do you as a law school compensate for that if that's not something they're going to do when they step into their first law school job? And how are you going to try to enforce this ban on technology in the classroom?
Yeah, so I should be clear. So we released a comprehensive AI strategy of which the goal is to make sure that the students learn to think without machines and with machines. And one piece of that was to limit the use of technology in certain classrooms, mostly the first year core classrooms. So that's part of what the policy is doing. But then it's also outlining all of the ways that we're going to integrate AI even further into what we're already doing. So for instance, reworking our first year legal research and writing curriculum, which every law student at our law school and other law schools in their first year learns how to write legal briefs, legal materials. And in that class, we're directly integrating more AI into the curriculum. Or our clinics, which is where the students in their second and third year work on real cases for real clients under the supervision of clinical professors. The clinics had already been using AI in many of their cases and their matters, but I think they're leading the charge thinking, how can we do more to ensure that the students at our law school are using the same tools that they'll be using when they go out to practice so that they're getting that experience early. But at core, across all these ideas, I think our philosophy is that we have to think about what's the essentially human skills that the students are going to need in practice, at least we hope for a while. And so, for instance, it's not just being able to answer a final exam question at the end of the class. It's be able to sit, listen, and have a conversation with someone and think quickly. That skill is going to be valuable if you're a law firm associate talking to a law firm partner talking to a client, a lawyer talking to a judge, a law school dean talking to a journalist. Whatever it is, I think that skill is not going out of fashion. And refocusing on the classroom away from just typing as fast as you can, sitting and listening and trying to respond more, I think is going to help teach those sorts of skills.
Very quickly here, we have about 30, 45 seconds. Are we entering a world in which there are going to be fewer lawyers as a result of this? How do you think about just the need for lawyers going forward as a result of the advent of AI?
So I think that AI is going to decrease the cost of many legal services. And typically what we've seen is when the cost for something goes down, demand goes up. So I think it's going to change the kinds of legal work that people do. But I'm not convinced that there'll necessarily be fewer lawyers.
All right. Adam Chilton, Dean of the University of Chicago Law School. Thank you very much for joining us. I took the LSAT, but I didn't end up applying.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I was thinking as I read into this, I remember taking large lecture classes in college, and kids would have their laptops open, and like what a distraction that could be. So even like exclusive of AI, I think there's something to be said for just like focusing without
I think so
phones
too.
or laptops
because,
in the classroom.
You know, if you have to listen, you have to listen. But if you don't, you're going to find a way not to.
Exactly. Multitasking.
All right, coming up, the World Cup final is tomorrow, pitting Argentina against Spain. We're going to look at the attention on FIFA's president and what that means for the future of the sport.
You can take us with you no matter where you go. You can watch us on Bloomberg Television, listen on Bloomberg Radio, stream the show live on the Bloomberg Business app, or find it at Bloomberg.com. Wherever you are, we are there. It is Bloomberg This Weekend. Stay with us. Weekend. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini. Later today in Miami, England will take on France in the World Cup bronze medal match. But throughout the tournament, the president of FIFA has drawn scrutiny for his relationship with President Trump and potential rule bending for Team USA.
We spoke with sports columnist Jonathan Wilson, the author of The Power and the Glory, A New History of the World Cup, about Gianni Infantino's legacy and his impact on FIFA.
February 2016, he takes over. And he says, right, we're going to clean everything up. He ostentatiously flies on a budget carrier to his first FIFA Congress. You'll have noted that's changed to the private jet.
Yeah, that didn't last long, but...
And he said, look, we've got far too many committees. We need to clear these out. It's massively inefficient. Then in 2024, a vote was taken to increase the number of standing committees at FIFA from 7 to 35. Now, the reason this is significant is that if you're a delegate representing one of the 211 FIFA members, you will be appointed to various committees. Each committee brings with it a stipend and very generous expenses.
That's where that money goes.
And that's where the money goes. And of course, if you're the delegate from country X, it doesn't matter if people in country X think, oh, yeah, FIFA's a disgrace, Infantino's an idiot, oh, we've got to get rid of him, the ticket prices are too high. He just thinks, I'm getting this lovely bunch of money, and why am I going to vote against a president who brings that to me?
So this is very strategic, expanding these committees.
It's basic clientelism. I mean, the other thing that the money does, and this is slightly more complex, there are two schemes. The Gold Project, which was introduced by Sepp Blatter in 1998, and the Forward Project, which is Infantino's great plan. And this redistributes money from FIFA to federations. So, for instance, say you're, I don't know, the FA of Gabon, and you say, look, we need a new national stadium. A national stadium's falling down. I actually think Gabonese national stadium's quite nice, but just for sake of argument, Gabon. And if people go, yeah, okay, we get you can't afford that, but it'd be useful if you had a nice new stadium. You can generate revenue through that, and so we'll give some of these great profits from the World Cup. And the World Cup is by far the biggest.
Level the playing field, kind of literally some places, but that seems like a nice mission.
But of course, none of these are properly audited. So there hasn't been a review since 2016, which is probably itself significant. But the review in 2016 said 81% of those 211 member nations are not properly audited. So
that money is going...
Well, who knows? But I think we can guess.
On that note, there's also... Infantino's been catching a lot of flack for this thing that happened with the U.S. player revoking the red card after...
Well, technically, he didn't revoke the red card. He suspended the suspension. So the suspension was suspended for a year. Exactly the same as he'd done with Cristiano Ronaldo, who was sent off in the penultimate qualifier. So he was given a 3-game ban for that. He served 1 game, and the final 2 games were suspended. Also, 3 other players, basically to make it obvious, or to make it less obvious that Ronaldo was getting dispensation because they want Ronaldo at the World Cup. And I think you can say this follows from the situation with the Club World Cup last year, where, I don't know if you remember, but essentially 2 Mexican teams who qualified had the same owner. You can't have that. One of them had to step down.
Oh, wow, okay.
So it should have meant the MLS champions got in, but instead it went to Inter Miami because that gets you Messi in because they finished top of the regular season.
There does seem to be a little weighting towards these more popular players.
This gerrymandering to get the most famous people involved. Yeah. Now, you might say, look, tennis tournaments, golf tournaments do this kind of thing all the time with wildcards. Let's get somebody famous, somebody popular. It drives revenue. Where's the problem? Well, the problem is it's one thing to do it if your tournament has 128 participants.
Right, and there's a slot specifically for those shenanigans. Yeah,
it's quite another when there is a qualification process, or if you're overriding a disciplinary process. So with Balogun, the fact he could play against Belgium, he is the first player since Garincha in 1962 to be sent off at the World Cup and not be suspended for the next game. And the reason that's so damaging, it's not just that it feels unfair, it's that it casts into doubt the integrity of the entire competition. So if you are, for instance, Egypt, who are very unhappy with some of the refereeing against Argentina, and I think you can understand a couple of 50-50 calls, key 50-50 calls went against them. And then I think, well, hang on, is that just because we were a bit unlucky, or is that because there is some directive from on high that Lionel Messi, because he's famous, because he generates revenue, has to be kept in the tournament?
This decision with the red card is quite controversial. You don't think that'll hurt him in the elections, or you think he has enough committees and other friends that he will get to stay?
There's already 200 of the 211 members who've said they'll back him. So it will be by acclamation. So, I mean, look, I think it has damaged him. And I think there's two aspects of this World Cup that have damaged him. So firstly that, I think there probably are good delegates who recognise this as a problem of integrity. There may even be quite cynical delegates who think, actually, if the integrity of the competition is undermined, is it going to carry on generating revenues it does? Is the world...
Right. At some point...
If the world loses faith, then, sport doesn't work without faith. The dramatic twists at the end, if you think that might have been scripted, well, then you're watching
You're not going to pay these absurd ticket prices if it's not real.
So...
We have that sport here. It's called wrestling.
Yeah.
Totally different audience, yeah.
So that's one element of it. The other is, I think, to do with... Infantino's made this big point of this is the most inclusive World Cup ever, which I'm afraid is clearly nonsense. When even one of his own referees, Omar Artan from Somalia, can't get into the country. Plus, I think it depends on the individual country, but roughly 80% of applications by fans and journalists from Africa to come to the tournament were turned down by the US and by Canada. That is by definition not inclusive. And given Infantino likes to portray himself as this champion of the global south, that is a position that's much harder to maintain. So I don't think it's going to have an immediate impact, but it has slightly weakened him. What it might mean is if you were planning to change FIFA's constitution to allow him to stand again in 2027, maybe he'll be a little more reluctant to do that.
Very interesting. It's such a complicated body and seems like not a whole bunch of oversight at the moment.
Looking here, a Bloomberg report that Gianni Infantino has clocked 57,000 miles during the course of this tournament on a Gulfstream.
Wow.
Chad, there you go.
No longer flying commercial.
No longer
exactly
flying.
Right.
All right, thank you all for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. You can join us again tomorrow starting at 7 a.m. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini, along with Alexis Christoforous. Lisa's back tomorrow. For our listeners on Bloomberg Radio, Masters in Business is up next.